Shalom, shalom, shalom. And the answer was David Robinson to the poll, the multiple choice poll question. I might put another one up before the day is over. NBA trivia question before Purim is over. I put up an NBA trivia question. Some of y'all got it right. But a lot of people picked Hakeem Olajuwon. Let me pull it up now while we're waiting. We're going to start in just a moment. I'm going to pull up the poll. And then we'll open up with prayer. Let's see. Yeah, 70% said Hakeem Olajuwon. 25% said David Robinson. No one picked Paul Gasol. And then a couple people picked Dirk Nowitzki. Yeah. And the question was, who am I? Hall of Famer, 10-time All-Star, 2-time NBA champion, 1-time scoring champion, 1-time rebound champion, 1-time block champion, 1-time defensive player of the year, 1-time MVP, rookie of the year, 10-time All-NBA, and 8-time All-Defense. And 70% of y'all said Hakeem Olajuwon. That's why I put him on there, though, because Hakeem Olajuwon matches for a lot of that, too. But, it's David Robinson. Although, David Robinson is a little better. Hakeem Olajuwon's probably a little better than David Robinson. All right. So let's open up with prayer, and then we'll get into this history lesson. All right. Stop this. All right. So let's open up with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time that you've allowed us to come together and do this history lesson and share knowledge and information with the people with history, specifically history as it relates to your word and your commandments, in this case, the Sabbath. We pray, Father God, that this lesson is insightful and that it'll give knowledge to people, specifically the people who come from this area or descend from these people. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All right. So the title of this lesson is A History of Shabbat Observance in Medieval East Africa. I'm going to also dedicate this lesson to my son, because my son, his mom is Kalenjian and from East Africa and Kenya. And those are Nihilistic peoples, but we're also going to be dealing with Bantus that live in East Africa as well, too, in this lesson. And on my side, so from my mom's side, I have Congolese Bantu ancestry, specifically Bavili, and it's just a branch of the Bakongo people. And then I also have Malagasy Bantu ancestry from Madagascar. So still related peoples, related to the Bantu peoples too that live in East Africa, because all the Bantu peoples are related, right? So this is directly related to his ancestry, his heritage too. So I want to dedicate this lesson to him, because I doubt in Canada that they're going to be teaching you this in school. When they start talking about medieval times, they're probably just going to focus on Europe, right? So we're going to deal with a little bit of history of medieval East Africa, right? And the main thing is going to be dealing with them keeping Sabbath keeping All right, so it's really a religious history. But I'd say like the first third part of this lesson, maybe to the first half, is going to be strictly dealing with the groundwork and giving you a background, a general overview of the overall history of East Africa during medieval times. So we're going to do that first before we get into the Sabbath keeping portion. Okay. So the objective in this history lesson, we will explore and document the observance of Shabbat or Sabbath in medieval East Africa, circa 500 AD to circa 1500 AD. And y'all know me, it's not really going to stay within those confines. I always go above and beyond. So we really going to take it. We're really going to take Sabbath keeping in East Africa all the way up to the colonial period or colonization period. So the late 1800s, that's how far we're going to take it. And we're going to start a little bit before the 500 AD as far as with the start. All right. Again, Shabbat has been observed by some segments of the East African population since Old Testament times or before Christ. Often overlooked by historians, East Africa had major conflicts during the time period in regards to Shabbat and Sunday law, right? And what that means is there was conflicts and battles fought over either keeping Sabbath or doing Roman Sunday law, right? And again, remember, you won't find anywhere in the Bible where it tells you to keep Sunday and that Sunday is the holy day. And you won't find anywhere in the Bible where it tells you you don't have to keep Sabbath. The Bible makes it very clear that you have to keep Sabbath. It's in the 10 Commandments. Jesus kept Sabbath. The disciples kept Sabbath. The apostles kept Sabbath. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. It's and you read nowhere in the Bible where it says to keep or observe Sunday. Right. So you have to ask yourself, where did that come from? Right, that came from the Romans and Constantine, and then after Constantine, later Roman Catholic popes establishing Sunday. That has nothing to do with the Bible or Jesus. Okay, has to do with the Romans and the Roman Empire, Gentiles. All right. East Africa had major conflicts during the time period in regards to Shabbat and Sunday law. East Africa has Semitic peoples. Right. So you have, and East Africa is very diverse, just like with biblical peoples. And when I say biblical peoples, I'm talking about ancient biblical peoples, like the people that are mentioned in the Old Testament. The majority of the people talked about in the Old Testament, you're going to find in Africa today. Right. So it says, I have here, East Africa has Semitic peoples. So you have Bantu Israelites, right? You also have Abrahamic descendants from Keturah. You have that in Ethiopia and in Eritrea with some groups. We'll get into that later. Jokatan descendants, all right, from and Jokatan was a descendant of Eber. So those are Hebraic peoples as well. And Ishmaelites from Arabs, because you have Arabs that came over into the Horn of Africa as well and intermingled, especially with the Somalis, right? And then you have Hamitic peoples, specifically Cushitic peoples and Nihitic peoples. And I have there for Nihitic peoples Mizraim, right? Because the majority of the Nihitic people come from those people that were living in Egypt and that the Bible describes descended from Mizraim, specifically Pathrusum. And Pathrusum is where Pathros was. So you're talking about southern Egypt and what is now kind of like northern Sudan or Northern Republic of Sudan. And they migrated from there down into Eastern Africa and some portions of Central Africa. But originally they were in Egypt. And even some of them were in some of the coastal portions of the Arabian Peninsula near the Sinai, the Sinai area, right? We will start with a generalized history of the region at that time. And if you want more, we have lessons dealing with the Nihitic people on the church's YouTube. Go on there, go to where the video section is, and where the videos are. And if you're on a computer, you can search and just put Nihilistic. And we have a whole lesson dealing with them. And we have a whole bunch of lessons dealing with Bantus as well, too, in their origins and history, right? So let's look at Isaiah chapter 18 before we really get into this. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 18. Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. That sendeth, and beyond the rivers of Ethiopia here, and when the Bible talks about Ethiopia, it's talking about Cush or Meroe, right? Which is what we dealt with last night with ancient Nubia, when we did the lesson dealing with the history of the Jews in ancient and medieval Nubia, right? So it's talking about there. So we're talking about beyond the rivers of what is now the Republic of Sudan and South Sudan. When you go beyond those areas, now you're talking about East Africa, the Horn of Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, and Southern Africa, right? Verse 2, that sendeth ambassadors by the sea, even in vessels of bulrushes upon the waters, saying, go ye swift messengers to a nation scattered and peeled, to a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled. All ye inhabitants of the world and dwellers on the earth, see ye when he lifted up an ensign on the mountains, and when he bloweth a trumpet, hear ye. For so the Lord said unto me, I will take my rest, and I will consider in my dwelling place like a clear heat upon herbs, and like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. For afore the harvest, when the bud is perfect, and the sour grape is ripened, and the flower, he shall both cut off the sprigs with pruning hooks, and take away and cut down the branches. They shall be left together unto the fowls of the mountains, and to the beasts of the earth, and the fowl shall summer upon them, and all the beasts of the earth shall winter upon them. In that time shall the present be brought unto the Lord of hosts of a people scattered and peeled, and from a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden underfoot, whose land the rivers have spoiled, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, the Mount Zion. Right? So here in verses 1 through 2, you see after the fall of Assyria, the Israelites were invited into sub-Saharan Africa by the Hamites. The first waves of migrants were welcomed. As time went on and more poured in, they stopped being welcome. For example, I have there, for example, Bantu expansion. Verses 3 through 7 refers to the second coming of Christ and the gathering of Israel, which went down into sub-Saharan Africa, right? And let's look at Zephaniah chapter 3. And we're probably not going to read all the way down to 20 from verse 8. But line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little, out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let a matter be established. Let's go to Zephaniah 3. Zephaniah 3 in verse 8. Therefore wait ye upon me, saith the Lord, until the day that I rise up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger. For all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. So this is talking about Christ's second coming, okay? And notice here, at Christ's second coming, he's going to also gather the Israelites that have been dispersed throughout the world and scattered via slavery, right? Scattered via captivity. He's going to gather them, right? All of them, okay? Who and where are these people from? All right, verse 9. From then will I turn, for then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord, to serve him with one consent. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering. In that day shalt thou not be ashamed. For notice here, so they're going to be coming from where? Beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. All right. So this is literally talking about beyond the rivers of, beyond the rivers of South Sudan and the Republic of Sudan. So we're talking literally West Africa, Central Africa, Eastern Africa, and Southern Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's where the Israelites primarily migrated to, right? After these different falls. So you had Israelites who were scattered to different places via captivity and after falls, right? But then you had other groups of Israelites who literally like migrated. Like they kept migrating further and further into Africa to escape. But then even then they finally got caught, i.e. transatlantic slave trade, i.e. Islamic Arab slave trade, right? Dig. All right, verse 11. In that day shalt thou not be ashamed for all thy doings, wherein thou hast transgressed against me. For then I will take away out of the midst of thee them that rejoice in thy pride, and thou shalt no more be haughty because of my holy mountain. I will also leave in the midst of thee an afflicted and poor people, and they shall trust in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel shall not do iniquity, nor speak lies. Notice here, this remnant of Israel is referring to them people beyond the rivers of Cush. You get it? All right. Meaning Sub-Saharan Africa. We're dealing with a specific group of people. These are, i.e., your Bantus, your Bantus, and a lot of your West Africans. Your Niger Congo family, right? Now, verse 13, wrapping this up. The remnant of Israel shall not do iniquity nor speak lies, neither shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth, for they shall feed and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. All right. Another reason this is going to be a real good lesson, especially dealing with East Africa, is because we're going to be dealing with everybody. We're not dealing with we may focus on one group. One group may get focused on a little bit more than another group, but we touching everybody. We touching the Bantus, we touching the Nilotics, we touching the Cushitic peoples, we touching the Semitic, Ethiopian, Eritrean peoples. We touching them all. Everybody is getting touched. We dealing with all groups, all right? Eastern Africa was first settled, and out there in parentheses, after a primitive pygmy Khoisan type population by Cushitic peoples. All right, so the first people in the region that we're dealing with here to settle there, East Africa, the first peoples to settle there were Cushitic peoples. All right, according to Genesis 10, verses 6 through 7, and the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan, and the sons of Cush, Seba, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Ramah, and Sabbatica, and the sons of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. All right, this corresponds to Cush, Seba, that equals the ancient Nubians. We dealt with them in last night's history lesson. What would be now modern day Sudan and modern day Republic of Sudan and South Sudan. All right, next you have Havilah. Havilah corresponds to modern day Djibouti and Zila, all right, or northern Somalia. All right, it also pertains to the proto-southern / central Arabian type. And what do I mean by that? The original inhabitants of that part of the Arabian Peninsula were Cushitic. The Semitic Arabians come later, right? All right. So yeah, I can already tell this is gonna be a good lesson. All right. It's gonna be a real good lesson. So we got so that's what that means, all right? And we're gonna peel every layer and we're gonna deal with everything. We're gonna go underneath every rock. We're not gonna skip anything. All right, we're gonna break everything down. All right. So we have next we have Sabta, right, which equals your northern Ethiopic Cushitic type, right? So northern Ethiopic Cushitic types, basically your Cushitic peoples that are in northern Ethiopia, Eritrea. I saw that too. That area, so you're a Ga people, Afar, you're a Beja people, etc. Right? Next you have Rama, right? And we don't need to deal with Rama. We need to deal with Sheba and Dedan because it named Sheba and Dedan his two sons, right? So with Sheba and Dedan, we have your Proto-Abyssinians, or Habisha, or Habasha, right? Your Axumites, and we dealt a little bit with Axum last night. We're gonna deal a lot with Axum today, right? So these are your when you see a lot of Ethiopians, Eritreans today, the Semitic ones, these are the the original people that were there, primarily were Cushitic. Later, which we're about to get into, you had some other groups who had the same name that they intermingled with, and each group conquered the other group, right? Which we're not going to get into a lot of that today. We're going to deal with it a little bit, but we're not going to get into it a lot. But it's just actually kind of crazy because you have to basically and the Bible documents this, and this lines up with history. You had Cushitic groups from Eastern Africa, primarily northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, who also conquered and lived in southern Arabia, right, and was there kind of first. Then you have these Semitic groups, same name, Sheba, right, same as the Cushitic groups, right, and Dedan, who come from Arabs like Jokatan, who's a descendant of Eber, which would make them Hebrews, because the word Hebrew comes from Eber. Anybody who's a descendant of Eber would be a Hebrew. And he founded the first branch of Arabs. They go down there to southern Arabia. And then Abraham has descendants from Keturah who also have the same name, and they live on the Arabian Peninsula. And they intermingle and go back and forth. And these groups conquer each other back and forth, all the way up until like circa 600 AD, when Muhammad and the rise of Islam steps on the scene. Okay, so originally, though, the people there, the prototype that was there before was Cushitic. Okay, and I have there in parentheses also Proto-Southern Arabian type. Next, we have Sabbatica. Okay. And here, Sabbatica, there I have it in the Hebrew, and pertains to a district of Ethiopia. The Targums describe it as Zingitani, which is basically land of the Zanj, okay, on the eastern borders of Ethiopia. And when they're saying the eastern borders of Ethiopia, they're not talking about the modern day country of Ethiopia. They're talking about in ancient times what was considered Ethiopia, which was a large swath of sub-Saharan Africa at that time. Okay, so according to the Targums, it was Zingitani. The Latinization Zingium serves as an archaic name for the coastal area in modern Kenya and Tanzania in southern East Africa. All right, so Sabbatica is dealing with those Cushitic groups that settled primarily in Kenya and Tanzania, right? Equaling your southern Ethiopic Cushitic types. Your Oromo, who you can find in southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya, southern Somalis, you can find in Somalia and eastern Kenya, the Dahalo that you can find in southern Kenya. And if I mispronounce a name, the pronunciation, a lot of these terms I've never even heard vocalized. I've just read them and studied, right? Some of them I have, some of them I haven't, and some I can't pronounce because I speak, American English, and I grew up in America, right? So I'm giving it the college try. So just bear with me. I'm not intentionally mispronouncing anything. All right. Our Nihilistic peoples, Mizraim, ancient Kemet, also Proto-Northern Arabians. migrated into Eastern Africa, largely remaining in the interior and western reaches. Lastly, we have Semitic peoples migrating into the area. This primarily consisted of Ethiopic Semitic, and I have there in parentheses Hebraic Sabians, right, descendants from Sheba, from Joktan, and then from Abraham, Sheba, and Dedan, right, which is basically your Habashi and Aksumite or modern day type. And these ones I can never pronounce, and I've never heard them. Tigrans, Tigrinas, right, etc. Okay, so you have them, which are primarily a mixture of these Sabians. That's what I just call them, is Sabians, because it's Sabian, Cushitic Sabians and Hebraic Sabians, right, from Joktan, from the Arabians, and then also from Abraham through Keturah. But anyways, then you have Falasha Jews or Falasha Israelites and Bantu Israelites, which the Falasha and the Bantu are related, right? And I have there in parentheses, so for example, for Bantu Israelites, and it's not just these groups, I'm just giving you examples, Kikuyu, Muru, Tutsi, Luba, etc. All right? So this is the region we're talking about. Anywhere in the gray is basically kind of we're not really dealing with. Only the areas in the gray that are like abutting the colored areas. So like those southeastern portion of Sudan, the eastern portion of South Sudan, the eastern DRC or Democratic Republic of Congo, northern Zambia, northern Malawi, and northern Mozambique, right? We're primarily today in this lesson going to be dealing with what is the modern day countries of Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda. All right. So I'm gonna leave this up for a second so we have some context. All right. So we're going to read from this history book, which will take us right into the background of medieval East Africa and what was going on. So we have the groundwork laid. And I forget where this looks like one of my college textbooks from like Gen Ed undergrad. Or was this high school? No, this looks like college. You know how you have to take the world civilization course? Yeah. You had to take that, right? I did. Yeah. And then remember how we always talk about is jacked up because they like, so like this one, A History of World Societies to volume 1 to 1715, right? So it's all the world's history. Volume 1 is everything from the beginning to 1715. Then, 1715 to now is its own thing. All right. Yeah. All right. I'll pull up this. Page 294. All right. Ethiopia, the Christian kingdom of Aksum. This is on page 294. Egyptian culture exerted a profound influence on the sub-Saharan kingdom of Nubia in northeastern Africa. Nubia's capital was at Meroe. Thus, the country is often referred to as the Nubian kingdom of Meroe. And this is a good segue in from last night's lesson into today's lesson, because last night we dealt with Nubia, right? As part of the Roman Empire, Egypt was naturally subject to Hellenistic and Roman cultural forces, and it became an early center of Christianity. Nubia, however, was never part of the Roman Empire. Its people clung to ancient Egyptian religious ideas. Christian missionaries went, and remember, in Nubia, they were still primarily worshiping Isis up until the 5th century AD. And that's why that's one of the reasons you had a lot of Israelites who migrated there too throughout the years, even before that, the ones who weren't wanting to worship Yahweh, the ones who were worshiping the idols and the ancient pagan gods, so that they could be there and worship who they want to worship. All right. La digression. Shall continue. All right. So notice here, though, I will document, just to be fair, for the Egyptologists and the Kemetic scholars, that yes, that does document that ancient Kemetic culture and ancient Egyptian culture was continuing to exist in sub-Saharan Africa after the fall of ancient Egypt. And when it was no longer being practiced in Egypt, it was being practiced in sub-Saharan Africa right after that. And at the end of ancient times, in the transition to medieval times or the Middle Ages, right? Anyways, continuing on. And also, too, another thing to remember, you're always going to have that mixture, even with the Israelites and the Semitic peoples, with Egyptian stuff. And the Bible confirms that because, like, Joseph's wife was an Egyptian. So the matriarch for the northern kingdom's patriarch, Ephraim and Manasseh, but primarily Ephraim, his mom was an Egyptian. The Israelites didn't even become a nation of people till after they spent a couple hundred years in Egypt, right? And then once they come out of Egypt, now they're a nation of people, but they were there for 200 years. Right, so you're going to find a lot of, and that's how they ended up developing into a people. So you're going to find a lot of similarities and things like that with the two. All right, continuing on. Nubia, however, was never part of the Roman Empire. Its people clung to ancient Egyptian religious ideas. Christian missionaries went to the Upper Nile region and succeeded in converting the Nubian rulers around 600 AD. By that time, there were 3 separate Nubian states, of which the kingdom of Nobatia, centered on Dongola, was the strongest. The Christian rulers of Nobatia had close ties with Ethiopia. According to Ethiopian oral tradition, right, so as we covered last night, there around 600 AD, there was established like 3 Christian kingdoms in what is now the modern day Republic of Sudan and South Sudan, right? According to Ethiopian oral tradition, so now we're switching over to Ethiopia and like the Horn of Africa. According to Ethiopian oral tradition, the Queen of Sheba visited the Hebrew king Solomon in Jerusalem to acquire some of his wisdom. They slept together and the queen conceived a son. When the boy reached maturity, he returned to Israel, received Solomon's blessing, and was crowned king of Ethiopia as Menelik I. Except for a period in the 12th and 13th centuries, all rulers of Ethiopia supposedly descended from Menelik. Because of the vast treasure of gold, spices, and precious stones that the Queen of Sheba took to Solomon's court, modern scholars believe that she actually headed a trade mission, although these scholars also identify the land of Sheba with modern Yemen. Artists usually portray the queen as a black woman. The legend suggests ancient contacts between Ethiopia and Western Asia. All right, continuing on, something I was going to point out. The Bible doesn't corroborate the story of that Solomonic line. And the Keber Nagas, the way it's outlined in the Keber Nagas, it doesn't line up. That being said, though, and the Bible tells us like Solomon's sons and their names. Could Solomon have slept with the Queen of Sheba? I don't know. The Bible don't tell us, but could he? That's possible. He had over 1,000 wives, right? And many of them wives were queens and princesses because he was forming alliances. And that's why, and they ended up turning his heart to their gods. I digress. Anyways, I take it more of as just a legend. I also believe the legend was also further, this is my personal opinion, was also further, what's the word? It was further promoted. It was further promoted there in ancient times, I think, by the actual Israelites that were there and the Jews that were living in the area, the ancestors of the Falasha. All right. Tradition ascribes to Frumentius, circa 300 to 380 AD, a Syrian Christian trader, the introduction of Christianity into Ethiopia. Kidnapped en route from India to Tyre, now a town in southern Lebanon, Frumentius was taken to Axum and appointed tutor to the future king Azana. Later, Frumentius went to Alexandria in Egypt, where he was consecrated the first bishop of Axum. Thus, Christianity came to Ethiopia from Egypt in the monophysite form. Shortly after, members of the royal court accepted Christianity. It became the Ethiopian state religion. The future of Ethiopia was to be inextricably tied up with Christianity, a unique situation in Black Africa. Ethiopia's acceptance of Christianity led to the production of ecclesiastical documents and royal chronicles, making Ethiopia the first Black African society that can be studied from written records. The scriptures were translated into Ge'ez, the language of Axum. Pagan temples were dedicated to Christian saints, and as in early medieval Ireland and in the Orthodox Church of the Byzantine world, the monasteries were the main cultural institutions of the Christian faith in Ethiopia. From the monasteries, monks went out to preach and convert the people, who resorted to the monasteries in times of need as the Ethiopian state expanded. Vibrant monasteries made daughter foundations, as in medieval Europe. Monastic records provide fascinating information about early Ethiopian society. All right, so notice here you had, so this is in the early stages of medieval times, right, or the early part of the Middle Ages, circa 600 AD, 700 AD, 500 AD. You have Christian kingdoms in what is now the Republic of Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the extent of their influence and reach goes to the border reaches of Somalia, of modern day Somalia, the border reaches of northern Kenya, and so forth. Okay. Now, picking this back up, monastic records provide fascinating information about early Ethiopian society. Settlements were made on the warm and moist plateau lands, not in the arid lowlands or the river valleys. Farmers, that was the point I was going to bring up though too. Some people, so you had a lot of groups who migrated out of there because of they migrated out of there because of the religion. They didn't want to be essentially Sunday Christian. Like, so you have people who still wanted to be idolatrous, or like I like to call it ooga booga, or do they juju or whatever, they magic, fetish, folk religion, that type of stuff, right? Traditional. Then you also had actual people practicing keeping the commandments and keeping Torah, which we're going to get. That's primarily who we're going to deal with in this lesson. You had some hardcore Jews, some hardcore Israelites, and who were like refused to do the Sunday Christian thing. All right. So you have all that going on. So I just want to point that out too. You have people who didn't want to get down with this, so they migrated further into sub-Saharan Africa. All right. Picking this back up. Plentiful rainfall seems to have helped produce abundant crops, which in turn led to population growth. In contrast to most of sub-Saharan Africa, both sexes probably married young. Because of ecclesiastical opposition to polygamy, monogamy was the norm, except for kings and the very rich. The abundance of land meant that young couples could establish independent households and widely scattered farms, with the parish church as the central social unit, seemed to have been the usual pattern of existence. And knowing the culture of the people of the modern day people who live in East Africa, and you have a lot of people who do polygamy, that would be another reason they would. You might have had people migrating out of Ethiopia and like South Sudan at the time, and the Republic of Sudan, and going further into sub-Saharan Africa as well. All right. Continuing. Something else I was going to point out. Oh, another thing I would point out too. You can even see what the language is. Even though you don't really, today there's not really any Bantu population in Ethiopia. And if there is, it's mainly like immigrants, modern immigrants. And so you mostly have the Semitic Ethiopians, and you have the Cushitic peoples, and you have some, I think there's some Nilotic people. But yeah. All right, but no Bantus. All right, not really any Bantus. But you can still see the legacy of the Bantus having been there and then later migrating to other places, because you find towns or places or regions with names like Bonga, right? And that's not Bonga is not like your typical what they classify as Afro-Asiatic. That's more classified as Niger-Congo words. You'll find things like that. Anyways, I digress. All right. Picking this back up, it says, above the broad class of peasant farmers stood warfare nobles. Their wealth and status derived from their fighting skills, which kings rewarded with grants of estates, with the right to collect tribute from the peasants. To acquire land and to hold warriors' loyalty, Ethiopian kings had to pursue a policy of constant territorial expansion. Nobles maintained order in their regions, supplied kings with fighting men, and displayed their superior status by the size of their households and their generosity to the poor. The Solomonid kings of Ethiopia, so called because of their theoretical descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, exerted their authority by constant travel to oversee and overawe their peoples and to extend their kingdoms. Another thing I want to point out is these the Ethiopian Christian kingdom. They actually were another way we know they went into other parts of Eastern Africa, like Kenya and places, is because they were heavily involved in the slave trade. And they owned slaves, and they provided a lot of slaves to the Arabs as well, right? And we'll deal with that a little bit in this lesson as well, all right? Until the 15th century, they had no truly permanent capital, but ruled from itinerant military camps. Amda Sion, who defeated Muslims at Afat and spread his kingdom to the south and west, proved to be Ethiopia's greatest ruler. From the 5th through the 7th centuries, Aksum was an important and cosmopolitan center whose mercantile activities played a part in international commerce. Its military and political power was the dominant influence in East Africa. The expansion of Islam in the 8th century introduced Aksum's trading contacts with the Byzantine Empire and ended its control of the Red Sea trade routes. Ethiopia's high mountains encouraged an inward concentration of attention and hindered access from the outside. 12th century crusaders returning from the Middle East told of a powerful Christian ruler, Prester John, whose lands lay behind Muslim lines and who was eager to help restore the Holy Land to Christian control. Europeans identified that king with Ethiopia. In the later 13th century, the dynasty of the Solomonid kings witnessed a literary and artistic renaissance, particularly notable for works of hagiography, biographies of saints, biblical exegeses, and manuscript illumination. The most striking feature of Ethiopian society in the period, from 500 to 1500, was the close relationship between the church and the state. Christianity inspired a fierce devotion intended to equate doctrinal heresy with political rebellion, thus reinforcing central monarchical power. Right. This next section is East African city-states, and we're on page 297. I'll put a picture up of how they used to document themselves. Let's see if y'all can see this without me going to the full screen. I think I don't have to go to the full screen, probably. Let me see. Put it up. And might just take an L. I was gonna try to show y'all how they image themselves. There's a picture from the 13th century. All right, they look like mulattoes with afros, essentially. All right. Picking this back up on page 297. The East African city-states. In the 1st century AD, a merchant seaman from Alexandria in Egypt sailed down the Red Sea and out into the Indian Ocean. Along the coast of East Africa and India, he found seaports. He took careful notes on all he observed, and the result, Parpilius of the Erythraean Sea, as the Greeks called the Indian Ocean, is the earliest surviving literary evidence of the city-states of the East African coast. Although primarily preoccupied with geography and navigation, the Parpilius includes accounts of the local peoples and their commercial activities. Even in the days of the Roman emperors, the Parpilius testifies the East African coast had strong commercial links with India and the Mediterranean. Greco-Roman ships traveled from Attalus on the Red Sea around the tip of the Gulf of Aden and down the African coast that the Greeks called I don't want to hold this up that way. All right. Azania in modern-day Kenya and Tanzania. These ships carried manufactured goods, cotton cloth, copper and brass, iron tools, and gold and silver plate. At the African coastal emporiums, Mediterranean merchants exchanged these goods for cinnamon, myrrh, and frankincense, captive slaves, and animal byproducts such as ivory, rhinoceros horns, and tortoise shells. Somewhere around Cape Gardoufi on the Horn of Africa, the ships caught the monsoon winds eastward to India, where ivory was in great demand. An omission in the Parpilius has created a debate over the racial characteristics of the native peoples in East Africa at the dates of Bantu migrations into the area. The author, writing in the 1st century, did not describe the natives. Apparently, he did not find their skin color striking enough to comment on. Yet, in the 5th century, there are references to these peoples as Ethiopians. This means that migrating Black Bantu speakers reached the East Coast between the 1st and 5th centuries. Possibly. The distinguished archaeologist Neville Chittick, however, thinks not. The writer of the Parpilius made few comments on the physical nature of the inhabitants of the countries which he described. Therefore, nothing can be based on the mere omission of any mention of skin color. In the first few centuries of the Christian era, many merchants and seamen from the Mediterranean settled in East African coastal towns. Succeeding centuries saw the arrival of more traders. The great immigration from Arabia after the death of Muhammad accelerated Muslim penetration of the area, which the Arabs called the Zanj, land of the blacks. Arabic Muslims established along the coast small trading colonies whose local peoples were ruled by kings and practiced various animistic religions, meaning traditional religions. Eventually, whether through Muslim political hegemony or gradual assimilation, the coastal peoples slowly converted to Islam. Indigenous African religions, however, remained strong in the interior of the continent. Beginning in the late 12th century, fresh waves of Arabs and of Persians from Shiraz poured down the coast, first settling at Mogadishu, then pressing southward to Kilwa. Everywhere they landed, they introduced Islamic culture to the indigenous population. Similarly, from the earliest Christian centuries through the Middle Ages, Indonesians crossed the Indian Ocean and settled on the African coast and on the large island of Madagascar, or Malagasy, and an Indonesian name. All these immigrants intermarried with Africans, and the resulting society combined Asian, African, and especially Islamic traits. The East African coastal culture was called Swahili, right? So basically just telling you that coastal culture of people that grew up on the coastal part or that developed in the coastal part of East Africa were primarily a mixture of the Bantus and Arabs, Persians, and Indonesians, right, that had sailed and did trade and settled in the area, right? And some of the Cushitic peoples too, because they were up in Mogadishu, right? All right. That's why there's so many layers and stuff of why I don't fool with a DNA test, because like someone might look at my son's eyes because he has Asian eyes, just like my eyes are like that a little bit, but his is even more than mine. And it's like, oh, that's because your grandma was Choctaw. Her dad was Choctaw. And so Native American, that's how he got that. And I'm like, maybe, or it could be because, or I'm like, it could be because my mom also has Malagasy ancestry, and the Malagasys have a strong Indonesian influence. It's like Indonesian and Bantu influence. So it could be that. If I got a DNA test done, it could come back and say all kinds of stuff, but it can't tell me and connect all that together, right? These are all different kinds of layers. Think about what I'm saying. And I can even go even more layers, even beyond that, with why the eyes might be like that. On his mom's side, like they're from Kenya and they're Nihilistic peoples, and they've been in that area for literally since ancient times, since biblical times, like biblical times. So there could be some of that Khoisan, them people, the people in Africa who actually have them eyes. You know what I'm talking about? There could be some of that in there. Who knows? All right. It's been so many generations and generations and all that stuff. It just turns into a cluster. Right. Anyways, picking this back up. All right. So on the coast, that's what you had really primarily going on. Swahili people, that's what they're primarily a mixture of. And in the interior, you have primarily Bantu peoples. Here, now where we're dealing with these city-states, you have Bantu people in the interior. Earlier, when we were talking about Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, that was just Cushitic and Semitic peoples. Here in the interior, you have Bantu peoples, right? And at that time in Ethiopia too, you had Bantus there at that time. You just don't have them anymore. Like most of them, the last remnants of that left out of Ethiopia by like the 1500s. All right. Picking this back up, the East African coastal culture was called Swahili after a Bantu language whose vocabulary and poetic forms exhibit a strong Arabic influence. The 13th century Muslim mosque at Mogadishu and the fiercely Muslim populations of Mombasa and Kilwa in the 14th century attest to strong Muslim influence. So Mogadishu, Somalia, Mombasa, coastal Kenya, and Kilwa, coastal Tanzania. By the late 13th century, Kilwa had become the most powerful city on the coast, exercising political hegemony as far north as Pemba and as far south as Sofala. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the coastal cities were great commercial empires comparable to Venice and Genoa. Like those Italian city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Mafia were situated on offshore islands. The tidal currents that isolated them from the mainland also protected them from landside attack. Much current knowledge about the life in the East African trading societies rests on the account of Ben Batua, who, when he arrived at Kilwa, he found in the words of a modern historian, the city, large and elegant, its buildings, as was typical along the coast, constructed of stone and coral rag. Houses were generally single-story, consisting of a number of small rooms separated by thick walls supporting heavy stone, roofing slabs laid across mangrove poles. Some of the more formidable structures containing second and third stories, and many were embellished with cut stone, decorative borders framing the entranceways. Tapestries and ornamental niches covered the walls, and the floors were carpeted. Of course, such appointments were only for the wealthy. The poorer classes occupied the timeless mud and straw huts of Africa. Their robes a simple loincloth, their dinner a millet porridge. Right? So they have some serious economic class disparities there. Right? Anyways, but that is I'll break that down for you in a minute. I want to break something else down. That's to be expected by the way by the way the society was set up. All right. So remember, we in the lesson we just did about the Luba earlier in the week, we went into a lot more detail about Kilwa and the Kilwa Sultanate and those city states and their founding. And if you remember, the Kilwa was originally established by Bantus and then this Persian prince. And the Persian prince himself was was half Persian and half Bantu. And he came with a trading party and ended up purchasing the island. But originally, Bantus had established it. And then if you look at Mombasa, same thing. On the coast of Kenya, originally Mombasa was founded by Bantus. And you had a Bantu queen named Congo-Wio. Excuse me. Congo-Wio, right? Then later you have them groups like later Arabs and Persians and stuff intermingling, right? All right. On the mainland were fields and orchards of rice, millet, oranges. Oh, the reason their economy was so jacked up, like, so notice here how this dude, when he traveled there to Kilwa, and this book don't tell you when this dude was there. Two Computer Shorty. Watch this. I'll tell you in a minute. So what time period? We talking about the 1300s. All right. So the reason their economy was so bunk like that in the 1300s where you have wealthy people living in houses with marble and carpet and rich tapestries and all this stuff. And what did he say? Constructed of stone, multiple rooms. All right, but then it says the poor people just wore loincloths and ate porridge and basically like rice and lived in huts. That these city states weren't really set up to sustain themselves. It was really only set up to sustain the wealthy people who live there. So kind of think like here in America now, like California, the coastal part of California, like is not really affordable for most people. You have to be wealthy or else you have to be kind of grandfathered in. Like, oh, I bought my house or I've been living here since 1940, 1950. And so you know, when I got this for a really, really cheap price, but now it's gotten to a point, and notice it's similar situation. You're talking about the coastal part of California. So you kind of have on the coastal part of California, you really either have just wealthy people or poor people. It's like it's not really that much in between, right? So that's kind of the same thing you have going on here because there's no way for them to be self-sustaining. In order for them to get their food supply, and we covered this in that Luba lesson, they have to import food from further in the interior of Eastern Africa. So they got to import food in further from the interior of Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern DRC, and they got to import that food there. All right. That's going to cause the food and things to be very, very expensive, right? There's not that many jobs. The jobs is going to just be specifically related in trade, right? So the poor people living there are going to be basically in a destitute situation. And a lot of them, I would imagine, would probably be classified as servants, right? From among the rich mercantile families that controlled the coastal cities, arose a ruler who by the 14th century had taken the Arabic title Sheikh. The Sheikh governed both the island city and the nearby mainland farther inland. Tribal chiefs ruled with the advice of the Council of Elders. The Portuguese approaching the East African coastal cities in the late 15th century were astounded at their enormous wealth and prosperity. This wealth rested on monopolistic control of all trade in the area. Some coastal cities manufactured goods for export. Mogadishu produced cloth for the Egyptian market. Mombasa and Malindi produced iron tools, and Sofala made cottons for the interior trade. The bulk of the city's exports, however, consisted of animal products, leopard skins, tortoise shells, ambergris, ivory, and gold. The gold originated in the Mutapa region south of the Zambezi River, where the Bantu mined it. As in 10th century Ghana, gold was a royal monopoly in the 14th century coastal city-states. The Mutapa kings received it as annual tribute, prohibited outsiders from entering the mines or participating in the trade, and controlled shipments down the Zambezi to the coastal markets. The prosperity of Kilwa rested on its traffic in gold. Right, so even here, these East African coastal city-states were engaged in heavy trade, even with kingdoms as far in the interior as Zambia. Right now, African goods satisfied the widespread aristocratic demand for luxury goods. In Arabia, leopard skins were made into saddles, shells were made into combs, and ambergris were made in the manufacture of perfumes. Because the tusks of African elephants were larger and more durable than the tusks of Indian elephants, African ivory was in great demand in India for sword and dagger handles, carved decorative objects, and the ceremonial bangles used in Hindu marriage rituals. In China, the wealthy valued African ivory for use in the construction of sedan chairs. I'm just realizing though. So that means like these people were like hunting elephants without guns. Like, think about that. Like, they were hunting elephants without guns. In exchange, for those natural products, the Swahili cities bought pottery, glassware, and beads, and many varieties of cloth. Swahili kings imposed enormous duties on imports, perhaps more than 80% of the value of the goods themselves. Even so, traders who came to Africa made fabulous profits. See, that's why I was saying their economy was jacked. If you were going to be, that is basically like coastal California. Like, that's why them poor people were in dire poverty, but the wealthy were living super lavish. They put high import taxes on goods. All right. Slaves were another export from the East African coast. Reports of slave trading began with the Parpilias. The trade accelerated with the establishment of Muslim settlements. So notice there that's been documented even before Islam. Even before Islam, they were taking slaves out of Eastern Africa and from the interior of Eastern Africa and Central Africa and Southeast Africa to the Middle East and Asia. All right. Going on. And in that case, too, it was the same thing. It was primarily Hamites, Cushitic peoples, Nubians, Nilotic peoples, and the Semitic Ethiopian. All right. And then they were selling them to the Arabs and other Middle Eastern people. And at that time, the Mediterranean world too, they sell them into the Mediterranean world as slaves as well, to India, all right, Southeast Asia. All right. Slaves were another export from the East African coast. Reports of slave trading began with the Paraplis. The trade accelerated, so basically like since the first century or New Testament times. The trade accelerated with the establishment of Muslim settlements in the 8th century and continued down to the arrival of the Portuguese, in the late 15th century. In fact, the East African coastal trade in slaves persisted at least to the beginning of the 20th century. So, and it went on all the way up until the last century, right? The slave trade coming out of East Africa. As in West Africa, traders obtained slaves primarily through raids and kidnapping. As early as the 10th century, Arabs from Oman enticed hungry children with dates. When the children accepted the sweet fruits, they were abducted and enslaved. Profit was the traders' motive. The Arabs called the northern Somali coast Ras Asir, Cape of Slaves. From there, Arab traders transported slaves northward up the Red Sea to the markets of Arabia, Persia, and Iraq. All right. And so here, the Arabs called the northern Somalia Ras Asir, Cape of Slaves, and the Somalis basically served as like middlemen to the Arabs, right? And then they sold the slaves that they got from the interior, right? Which a lot of times those slaves were Bantus, right? You also had some of the other Cushitic groups, women get taken to, but that was primarily to be wives or forced concubines of like the Oromo people and some of the Habasha people. All right. Picking this back up, the Arabs called the northern Somali coast Ras Asir, Cape of Slaves. From there, Arab traders transported slaves northward up the Red Sea to the markets of Arabia, Persia, and Iraq. Muslim dealers also shipped blacks from the region of Zanzibar across the Indian Ocean to markets in India. Rulers of the Deccan Plateau in central India used large numbers of black slave soldiers in their military campaigns. Slaves also worked on the docks and dhows, which are Arab ships, in the Muslim-controlled Indian Ocean, and as domestic servants and concubines throughout South and East Asia. Right? As early as the 10th century, sources mention persons with black bodies. And I like reading stuff like this because we always just tend to focus on the transatlantic slave trade with the diaspora, and we never focus on East Africa and the Indian Ocean and that diaspora, right? In the diaspora that's in, Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, we tend to neglect that, right? As early in the Middle East, as early as the 10th century, sources mention persons with lacquer black bodies in the possession of wealthy families in Song, China. In 1178, a Chinese official noted in a memorial to the emperor that Arab traders were shipping thousands of blacks from East Africa to the Chinese port of Guangzhou, or Canton, by way of the Malay archipelago. Right? So basically they're saying here that thousands of blacks were being shipped yearly to China, specifically Canton, that were coming from Eastern Africa, but through Southeast Asia, the Malay archipelago. So they're talking about through like Indonesia. Remember how we did that lesson on the Bantus in Indonesia? All right. Anyways, the Chinese employed these slaves as household servants, as musicians, and because East Africans were often expert swimmers, as divers to caulk the leaky seams of ships below the waterline. By the 13th century, Africans living in many parts of South and East Asia had made significant economic and cultural contributions to their societies. Neither Asian nor Western scholars have adequately explored this subject. It appears, however, that in Indian, Chinese, and East African markets, slaves were never as valuable a commodity as ivory. Thus, the volume of the Eastern slave trade did not approach that of the trans-Saharan trade. Right? And that's another part of the Islamic slave trade. So they're just letting you know that the Indian Ocean trade was not as large as the trans-Saharan trade of the Islamic slave trade. But it predates Islam though by a few hundred years. It's another one of them things where it's like we're not gonna get into which one is worse. They were all bad. Like, this is all bad. All right. Here's something to look at on your own time. I'm gonna leave this up for 30 seconds. Screenshot it, use snipping tool. If you don't know what screenshot is, Google it. If you don't know how to use snipping tool, Google it and snipping tool this. And after the lesson, read these articles. Because basically that them Swahili city-states, and specifically the Kilwa Sultanate, they found coins from like the 10th century, Kilwa in Australia, multiple coins. So that either means that people from East Africa were sailing to Australia, or that means someone from Arabia or India or Indonesia, maybe some Austronesian people who had sailed to East Africa and were engaged in trade and also sailed to Australia, right, left them coins there. The point though is it doesn't matter which one of those it was that did it. That lets you know that all of those groups have probably at some point already made contact with Australia, right? So, like, by the time the Europeans so-called discovered Australia, like most of the world at that time had already discovered it. That's why this book that's why, remember how we were talking about the book goes from the beginning to 1715. Then it picks up everything around the 1700s, right? Because the Europeans like to focus on that because that's when they start discovering things, you know, like the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s. And it's like these are things a lot of the rest of the world had already been known about, right? All right. So this picture here, and y'all take a look at this. So on the right side, where I have my mouse at now, that's in Ethiopia, right? And that was built in medieval times in Ethiopia, right? And they have a lot of those. And then these are ruins on the left of Kilwa in Tanzania, right? Also built during medieval times in Tanzania, and those are some ruins. And there's a lot of ruins like this scattered throughout Eastern Africa. Yeah, they built that stuff like in the mountains and in the it's not underground per se. It's like digged into the mountain, digged into the hill, and stuff like that. All right. And this other stuff too, I will point out just how with our people, how like with us, how stupid we be. Like we take vacations and stuff. Oh, I'm gonna go to Italy and go to Rome and see the ruins and the Colosseum and all this stuff. And you can go to Africa and do the same stuff, right? And it'd be related to your own people and literally do the same stuff. You go to Tanzania, chill on the coast for a little while. You know what I'm saying? Go see the ruins of Kilwa, have a nice vacation, and get the whole same experience. All right. So this is a map of medieval kingdoms in sub-Saharan Africa at the time we're going to be dealing with Sabbath keeping. This is just giving you a general idea of not all, but most of the kingdoms. And this is from Ancient History Encyclopedia. If I was doing this myself, I would double the size of every single circle as far as like the extent of what they were over or sphere of influence or control. I would double the size of every circle. All right. So this is from Ancient History Encyclopedia, Kingdom of Abyssinia. The Kingdom of Abyssinia was founded in the 13th century AD and transforming itself into the Ethiopian Empire via a series of military conquests lasted until the 20th century AD. It was established by the kings of the Ptolemaic dynasty, who, claiming descent from no less a figure than the Bible's King Solomon, would rule in an unbroken line throughout the state's long history. A Christian kingdom which spread the faith via military conquest and the establishment of churches and monasteries. Its greatest threat came from the Muslim trading states of East Africa and Southern Arabia, and the migration of the Oromo people from the south. Right, and also you had with them trying to force Christianity on people. Like I said, you had a lot of people migrate out of Ethiopia because of that. All right. The combination of its rich Christian heritage, the cult of its emperors, and the geographical obstacles presented to invaders meant that the Ethiopian Empire would be one of only two African states never to be formally colonized by a European power. The Ethiopian highlands, with their reliable annual monsoons, rainfall, and fertile soil, have been successfully inhabited since the Stone Age. Agriculture and trade with Egypt, Southern Arabia, and other African peoples ensured the rise of the powerful kingdom of Axum, which was founded in the 1st century AD, flourishing from the 3rd to 6th century AD, and then surviving as a much smaller political entity into the 8th century AD. The kingdom of Axum was the first sub-Saharan African state to officially adopt Christianity, circa 350 AD. Axum was also created its own script, Ge'ez, which is still in use in Ethiopia today. The kingdom of Axum went into decline from the late 6th century AD, perhaps due to overuse of agricultural land, the incursion of Western Beja herders, and the increased competition for the Red Sea trade networks from Arab Muslims. The heartland of the Axum state shifted southwards, while the city of Axum fared better than its namesake kingdom and has never lost its religious significance. In the 8th century AD, the Axumite port of Adulis was destroyed and the kingdom lost control of regional trade to the Muslims. It was the end of the state, but not the culture. Bridging the gap between Axum and the kingdom of Abyssinia was a third kingdom, that of Zagwe, with its capital at Roha, 300 kilometers south of Axum. Founded in 1137 AD by a commander of Lasta in unclear circumstances, the new kingdom continued to promote Christianity in the region and still possessed many of the cultural and artistic traditions of Axum. The kingdom expanded from its heartland in northern Ethiopia thanks to a large and well-equipped army, especially in the pagan west and south. One famous king, Lalibela, ordered rock-cut churches to be built, and such was their effort on the populace that the capital was renamed in his honor. The medieval kingdom of Abyssinia was founded by the Solomonid dynasty circa 1270 AD, their first ruler being Yekuno Amalek, a local leader at Amahara. It is likely that the Solomonids saw the kings of Zagwe as usurpers, an interpretation that the dynasty that had ruled Axum, and they gathered the support of anti-Zagwe factions, which had presented continuous opposition throughout the 12th and 13th centuries AD. And this is because the Zagwe were Cushitic peoples. They were Aga people, right? And we're going to get into that later. They were a Cushitic people, and they were actually put in power by Israelites. Some Jews put them in power, right? Some Ethiopian Jews, but we're about to get into that, right? And so these the Ethiopian Semitic peoples wanted to restore their old dynasty, right? So that's basically what this is dealing with. The Zagwe dynasty contributed to its own downfall by always having disputes over who had the right of succession. Even the great Lalibela had been briefly deposed by his own nephew, Yekuna Amalek, and his successors, according to both oral and written medieval traditions, which were mostly compiled in the 13th or 14th century AD, like the Kebra Nagas, but possibly using older sources. Claimed direct descent from the biblical King Solomon of Jerusalem and Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, equated with Ethiopia in this tradition, but more likely to be southern Arabia, hence their dynastic name of Solomonid. The story goes that the Queen of Sheba visited. I'm going to skip that part. We already basically covered that. By the time I skip, I could have just read it. All right. The claim may have been dubious indeed. There is, in any case, no direct evidence of a historical King Solomon ruling Israel in the 10th century BC, but it does seem that the Ethiopian kings themselves believe their heritage, or at least publicly claim. And this is a secular source, but so he's saying there's no historical evidence, but there is historical evidence. But anyways, but it does seem that the Ethiopian kings themselves believe their heritage, or at least publicly claim to. King Zara Yacob, right, who ruled from 1434 to 1468 AD, was asked about his ancestry at his coronation and boldly stated, "I am the son of David, the son of Solomon, the son of Menelik," quoted in Curtin, page 141. The claim may have been fabricated and was certainly perpetuated in order to give legitimacy to the Solomonid line. Many Solomonid kings held their coronation at Axum because of the Ark of the Covenant connection there. It is also interesting to note that in Ethiopian literature on what constitutes good kingship, two things are held as vital: descent from a person like Solomon, who had made a holy covenant with God, in possession of the sacred ark of the covenant. Ethiopian kings were fortunate to claim both, and by association, the people of Ethiopia were able to also claim they were God's chosen people, a point reinforced by the Christian kingdom's isolation in East Africa, surrounded as it was by states which were predominantly Muslim, Jewish, or practiced traditional African beliefs. All right, so notice there he says in East Africa at the time, that's what you had, basically. All right, and you can almost divide it, pretty much divide it equally, 25% each, right? So basically in East Africa during medieval times, about 1/4 of the people were Muslim, 1/4 of the people were Sunday Christian, 1/4 of the people were Jewish, and even the 1/4 that was Sunday Christian, a lot of them were keeping Sabbath, which we're going to get into. So basically during medieval times, you could say 1/4 to half the population of East Africa was keeping Sabbath, possibly more than half, because you even had Muslims that were keeping Sabbath. And we'll get into that too. But and I know I still need to do that lesson on, wasn't a lesson, a workshop on evangelizing to Muslims. And when I do that, I am going to do the workshop, and when I do it, I'll bring out the many verses in the Quran where it tells them to observe Sabbath. The problem that you'll find with Muslims is the same problem you find with a lot of Sunday Christians. They don't read their Bible. They don't read their Quran. So they don't know stuff. And then if they do, they only read certain sections that they like. That's been reinforced by their pork chop pastor or their falafel imam. You know what I'm talking about? What'd you say? No, I have to say it on. Yeah. Bring it out. Con. All right. So basically here, notice what it says. The Christian kingdom's isolation in East Africa, surrounded as it was by states which were predominantly Muslim, Jewish, or practiced traditional African beliefs. So 25% of the population was Jewish or Israelites or practicing, and if they weren't actual Israelites, they were still practicing keeping the Torah, and it's not even Judaism because they didn't have the Talmud, right? So this is like just straight fear God, keep the commandments. We using the Torah, right? Basically the truth. We'll just call it the truth, some form of it, right? So you had 25% of the population of East Africa in some form of the truth. You had another 25% of East Africa's population in Sunday Christianity, Roman Christianity. But even with that, it was an East African version, which was very, very different and very, very reluctant to a lot of the Roman stuff and highly influenced by the Jews or the Israelites. So not even really Roman. And they kept Sabbath, a lot of them, right? And then you had another 25% that did the traditional African beliefs. And the traditional Africa is just the Ooga Booga, the Juju, and it's the same thing the ancient Israelites in the Old Testament practiced when they weren't worshiping Yahweh, when they were being rebellious, which was most of the time. All right, syncretic worship. Like, yes, there's Yahweh, and in these traditional beliefs of our people that they have over there in Africa, Yahweh is the sky god or the great creator God. That's him. But he's up there and we don't want to deal with him. So we have these other gods, these other spirits. And then we also have the ancestors, which is really just familiar spirits. And if I do good when I die, I'll go to be with my ancestors if I was a good boy, right? That's essentially the same thing you find them practicing in the Old Testament when they're being rebellious to Elohim. All right. So that's pretty much breakdown of the religious beliefs in East Africa at the time. All right. And with that, about probably anywhere from 1/4 to half the population kept Sabbath. All right. Because like I said, even some of the Muslims did too. All right. Moving on. All right, let's read this last part. For the Ethiopian people, they were the second Israel. That is not to say traditional African religion was wholly eradicated in Abyssinia. Even the king performed a ritual sacrifice of a buffalo and a lion when he was crowned. All right. The kingdom of Simeon. Now we're going to get into the Jew and Israelite component, right? The kingdom of Simeon, okay, or the kingdom of Beta Israel. I think another name is the kingdom of Gideons as well, too, right? Was an ancient kingdom of the Beta Israel centered in the northwestern part of the Ethiopian Empire that came to an end in 627 AD during the reign of Emperor Susios I. It was preceded by a number of regions which were in Jewish rule in the northwest part of Ethiopia. The Jewish Ethiopian tradition dates the establishment of the kingdom of Simeon to the 4th century, right after the kingdom of Axum turned to Christianity during the reign of Azana of Axum. All right, so notice here in the map, that section in the green is letting you know where the kingdom of Simeon was located, right? Also notice here down at the bottom, that second picture is Judah's Field. I had the black thing come up. An area full of ruins of destroyed buildings, which according to tradition were ruined by the forces of Queen Judith. All right, and we're about to deal with Judith in a moment. All right, so now we're going to read from this book, the Historical Dictionary of Ethiopia, okay, 2nd edition. Falashas. The Falashas are Ethiopian Jews referred to themselves while they were living in Ethiopia as Beta Israel, House of Israel. Most lived near Gondar and to the west and north toward the Sudan border. Their religion was a primitive form of Judaism based on the Old Testament and the Book of Jubilees. Falashas did not speak Hebrew. Well, think of something like that. All right. Their religion was a primitive form of Judaism based on the Old Testament and the Book of Jubilees. Falashas did not speak Hebrew. They spoke Aramaic or Tigrinya, depending on the location of their villages. They did not have knowledge of the basic rabbinical writings such as the Talmud and the Mishnah. Major villages had a synagogue and at least one priest. They used a complex ceremonial calendar based on the solar and lunar years. They observed major Jewish holidays and fasts. They kept the Sabbath in an orthodox manner according to the Old Testament. Falasha literature and the Torah were written in Ge'ez, an early South Semitic language. The origin of the Falashas is obscure. They claim they are Jews who came to Ethiopia with Menelik I, the alleged son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Others believe they migrated to Ethiopia when the Hebrews left Egypt during the Exodus, or are descended from Jews who came after the destruction of the first or the second temple. Still others argue they are indigenous Agu people who converted to Judaism. Their name probably comes from the Ethiopic falasa, which means to immigrate. There are secondhand references to the Falasha by travelers to Ethiopia dating back to the 9th century. The explorer James Bruce aroused the Western world's curiosity about the Falasha when he mentioned them in his 18th century travel account about the region. By the early 20th century, pro-Falasha groups had sprung up in various countries. In 1975, Israel recognized, and we could stop at that part. They ended up going into, a lot of them ended up being taken out of Ethiopia in the last 50 years and brought into the modern state of Israel. Right? So this is from the next source we're going to read from, the Beta Israel or Falasha in Ethiopia, from earliest times to the 20th century. Right? The Beta Israel in Ethiopia, from earliest times to the 20th century, by Steve Kaplan. Ethiopic at an early date. More surprising, however, is the presence of a significant number of works dealing with religious concepts and practices that derive from Jewish Aramaic or Hebrew. Words such as meswat, alms, tabat, art, and tawat, idol, are all distinctively Jewish in either form or content. Similarly, in Ethiopic, the name for the sixth day, Ard, does not follow the system of naming for the other days of the week. First are Sunday, second are Monday, third for Tuesday, etc. The name Arb for Friday does not mean six, but eve, or evening, and refers to the eve of the Jewish Sabbath. As H.J. Pulaski has observed, it seems hardly possible that the Aramaic words should have been introduced by the Syriac-speaking missionaries. None of these words is distinctively Christian in meaning. What they denote belongs to the Jewish leaven in Christianity. In other words, in the view of Pulaski and most other scholars, such loan words could only have been introduced to Ethiopia prior to the introduction of Christianity and the translation of the Bible. The Hebraic Jewish elements were part of indigenous Aksumite culture adopted into Ethiopian Christianity. With regard to loan words, moreover, these are all, and I forget, we read something recently where it was like they even said, we might have read something recently, or it might come up in here, but where they talked about 50% of Aksum's population could have been Israelites or Jews. All right. Continuing on. With regard to the loan words, moreover, these are almost certainly the products of direct contact with Jews and our Judaism, and cannot be explained as an example of Amicio Verterius Testamenti. Thus, the linguistic evidence would seem to clearly indicate that Jewish influences in Ethiopia were, at least in part, both early, for example, Aksumite, and direct. Additional support for this view can be gleaned from the Ge'ez versions of several Old Testament and apocryphal books. Although in general agreement that the Greek version is the primary source for most of these texts, scholars have produced numerous examples of the Ge'ez version's direct dependence upon either a Hebrew or Aramaic vorlage. While the precise circumstances under which such Hebrew Ethiopic or Aramaic Ethiopic elements entered the text cannot be determined, and some may even date to later recensions, much of this material would seem to be associated with the original Ethiopic translations. On the basis of the cultural elements, loanwords, and textual evidence cited above, it appears possible to offer some clear suggestions concerning the earliest Jewish influences on Ethiopian culture. The first carriers of Judaism reached Ethiopia between the rise of the Aksumite kingdom in the beginning of the Common Era and conversion to Christianity of King Azanza in the 4th century. They used Aramaic for religious purposes and probably brought with them texts in that language and perhaps Hebrew, given the predominantly literary and linguistic evidence. And before I go to the next slide, I want to point out, they said here that the Jews started first heavily arriving in Aksum, right, or what is modern day Ethiopia and Eritrea, around the 1st century, right? So around the time of Christ and the New Testament, and around the time of the New Testament, right? And they kept arriving up until, in large numbers, up until the 400s, right, or the time of King Azanza when when the kingdom of Axum converted to Christianity. So a lot of these were Jews or Israelites that were leaving out of Nubia. That's why I had these lessons kind of line up the way I had them line up, so that if you watched the one last night, it flows directly into today's lesson. All right, so these were a lot of Jews coming out of Nubia, but you also had a lot coming out also over from Yemen. All right. How one can demonstrate a historical link between a little-known group that disappeared long before the Christian era and a community whose religious system can only be documented beginning in the 15th century. These difficulties aside, it must be admitted that an Elephantine connection could explain some features of Beta Israel culture. The Elephantine and Beta Israel communities are almost unique among Jewish groups in their practice of a sacrificial ritual outside the land of Israel. Even here, however, it must be admitted that important differences also exist. While the Jews of Elephantine perform their sacrifices in a temple, the Beta Israel Masig, house of worship, was used primarily for prayer. Sacrifices were performed in the open air. In fact, when a careful comparison is made between the religious life of the two communities, differences can be shown to greatly outweigh similarities. The attitudes toward the Sabbath presented by the two communities are, for example, a study of contrast. Although the Elephantine papyri contain no explicit mention of Sabbath observance in that community, one can easily concede Portland's claim that the local Jews were aware of and commemorated the day in some way. The Sabbath, he concludes, appears to have been honored more in the breach than in the observance at Elephantine. Nothing could be farther from the custom of the Beta Israel, among whom the Sabbath is accorded tremendous respect and celebrated with great rigor. Moreover, the Sabbath observance of the Beta Israel differs substantially from that of the Elephantine Jews, not only in degree, but also in kind. The Beta Israel's rules concerning the Sabbath, as well as many other features of their religious life, are strongly influenced by the Book of Jubilees, a work composed in the middle of the 2nd century BC, long after the Elephantine community had ceased to exist. Thus, the Sabbath as observed in Elephantine can scarcely be said to have resembled that of the Ethiopians. Nor is this the only major difference between the two communities. The Aramaic texts found at Elephantine are in a dialect quite different from that of the Aramaic loanwords in Ge'ez. And accordingly, this colony, I had a thing in the freezer. I forgot about it. A can. Can you take it out? Like, it's been in there so it don't explode. Probably just need to leave it out. Okay. It's been in there for hours. For at least like 3-4 hours. Moreover, the Sabbath observance, no, we read that part. Nor is this the only major difference between the two communities. The Aramaic texts found at Elephantine are in a dialect quite different from that of Aramaic loanwords in Ge'ez, and accordingly, this colony could not have been a source of these linguistic influences. Supporters of the Elephantine origins of Ethiopian Judaism have generally preferred to ignore the clear evidence of religious syncretism in the Egyptian community's life. While there can be little question that Yahu, or Yahweh, the God of heaven, was the primary focus of religious attention for the Jewish garrison, proof also exists that other gods were units. The elements held in common may well have outweighed those that differentiated between the various groups. The fortunes of the young, let me make sure I didn't go too far in the slide. No. All right. I skipped to page 37. All right. So now we're skipping to dealing with the time around circa 500 AD. All right, at the beginning portion of the medieval period. War in 525 AD against the Judaized king of the Himyarites, Yusef Dunuwas, In the first quarter of the 6th century, the struggle for supremacy in South Arabia between Judaism and Christianity took the form of a series of persecutions, martyrdoms, and military struggles, which eventually involved not only the local population, but also Byzantium and Ethiopia. Events began to move toward a climax circa 520, when the king of the Hammuratis, who had converted to Judaism and taken the name of Yusuf, massacred the Christians in the important South Arabian city of Narjan. The task of avenging the martyrs. Now, mind you, I've asked some people from Yemen about this, like people who actually from Yemen, and they tell me that the dude really was a Jew. Like they don't say he was a convert. Like they were like, nah, he was they were Israelites. I'm like, okay. All right, so take that with a grain of salt. I guess nobody knows. Maybe they were Arabs who just converted, or they were actually Israelites, right? We know there were Jews and Israelites in the region at the time, but as far as this kingdom, maybe it was actual Jews or maybe they were converts, right? And then it's like the same thing can kind of be said with the Ethiopian kingdom fighting fighting them. But in that case, same thing. It's like, no, that one we know that with the Solomonic line, it doesn't add up. But anyways, picking this back up at I'll take it there. The task of avenging the martyrs and restoring the Christian position in the region fell to the Ethiopian ruler Caleb. In the year 525, Caleb led a military expedition to South Arabia, which defeated and killed the Judaized Hammurati ruler and established Ethiopian sovereignty over the area. Before returning to Aksum, Caleb established a new law code and engaged in a variety of building projects, including the construction of a number of churches. Even on the basis of this brief summary of this period, it is possible to suggest that these events could easily have led to a deterioration of relations between Jews and Christians in Aksum. A more detailed examination reveals numerous additional reasons to assume that this was in fact the case. Du Nuwas, for example, may well have taken the name Yusuf as part of a semi-messianic program, which also included a state run along biblical lines. Caleb, for his part, was the first Ethiopian ruler to assume a biblical name. His choice, moreover, of the name of a progenitor of the Davidic house was probably deliberate. Thus, the two biblical name protagonists confronted each other. Yusuf, the Jewish king of Himyar, who scoffs at the claims of one who has for him only a Cushite pretender, not a genuine Israelite. Caleb, who claims descent from Israel in the flesh as the lineal descendant of Solomon's firstborn, and also from Israel in the spirit as the Christian king of the new Zion. Right? So notice that this is all playing out here in Eastern Africa and Southern Arabia. Like these people are basically fighting over who should rule, who's the real Jew, the real Israelite, right? And what's the best way to go, right? Should we do Sunday stuff or should we do Sabbath and do stuff more strict biblical? All right. Caleb was, however, both an Israelite and a devout Christian. Even if one discounts some of the hagiographic excess of our sources, it is abundantly clear that Christianity was not merely a political tool for Caleb. His expedition to South Arabia had the clear character of a crusade. His policies of evangelizing, legislation, and church building all witness his pragmatic approach to his faith. His destruction of idols, pagan temples, and synagogues all beseech a major transformation of policy. The former broad tolerance and moderate protection of Christians changed into active propagation of Christianity, which had been proclaimed as the state religion. As several authors have noted, Caleb's program of simultaneously exalting his Israelite descent while pursuing vehemently anti-Jewish policies is precisely the same seemingly contradictory combination of themes one finds in the Keber Nagas. Indeed, this combination has led at least one author to argue rather convincingly that this quintessential Ethiopian work originated in the time of Caleb. In fact, as we shall see in later chapters, the opposition between bad Jews and good Israelites is one that recurs throughout the history of Ethiopia in general and the Beta Israel in particular. On the basis of the information presented above, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that the first quarter of the 6th century must have been an especially trying time for the most Judaized groups in the Aksumite kingdom. The extreme politicization of religious identity in South Arabia may well have made itself felt by a hardening of distinctions in Aksum as well. The hitherto vague differentiation between Judaized groups and the growing number of Old Testament-oriented Christians may have become far sharper. All right, so notice here, so you had going on now in East Africa, you had Jews or Israelites, you had groups that have been influenced or converted to doing things the Israelite way or the truth, keeping Sabbath and all the commandments and doing that. And then you had Sunday Christians who were also, though, strongly influenced by the Old Testament and also kept Sabbath and Sunday. And it's saying it made it difficult when you look at the history and study the history of the time. Sometimes it's hard to differentiate between groups because of that. All right, precisely how they were, even if they were not subject to overt persecution, it must be remembered that in the early 7th century, Ethiopia enjoyed a reputation for religious tolerance. The position of the former could not have been an easy one. Precisely how they responded is not recorded, although several tantalizing clues permit us to engage in some informed if very tentative speculation and suggest that they began to migrate away from Aksum to more peripheral areas to the southwest. All right, so when they're talking about more peripheral areas to the south, to the southwest of Aksum. As is well known during most of their recorded history, the Beta Israel resided in the regions around Lake Tana, including Wagara, Salmat, and the Simeon Mountains. Exactly how they came to be in these regions remains a mystery. Almost certainly their presence must be the result of the migration of Jews or Jewish influences from the Aksum region. In this context, it is interesting to note some of the earliest references to the Simeon region. In 525 AD, the Greek traveler Cosmas Indocoplistes, sailor of the Indian Sea, visited Ethiopia. Among the valuable information he recorded was an inscription by an unknown king found in the city of Attalus, known as the Monumentum Aldotanum. This text makes mention of the king's victories across the Nile against a number of peoples, including the Athagas, Kala, and Samina. The last of these are said to reside in inhospitable mountains covered with deep snow. Cosmas comments, as for the Semini, where he says there are snow and ice, it is to that country the king of the Aksumites expatriates anyone whom he has sentenced to be banished. Thus, writing at precisely the time of Caleb's expedition against Du-Nuwas, Cosmas is familiar with the Simeon, in later periods, an important area of Beta Israel settlement, as a region of exile and banishment. Might not this have been the fate of some of the Judaized residents of Aksum during the time of Caleb's campaign against their co-religionists in South Arabia? All right, so essentially these Israelites ended up in these more central portions of Ethiopia after having been banished from northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. All right. Some support for this admittedly speculative suggestion may be found in the enigmatic phrase Bazaya Talala Falas, At this point, the Falasha were separated, which appears in a medieval Ethiopian document. While the use of the name Falasha certainly dates to this text to the 15th or 16th century, the tradition of a Jewish group separating itself or being separated from the bulk of the population may be an ancient one. Certainly, the text itself introduces this phrase almost immediately after a mention of Menelik I, which would at least hint that it refers to the Aksumite period. Finally, one last piece may be added to this picture. According to many Ethiopian traditions, Caleb abdicated, became a monk, and was succeeded by his son Gabra Maskell. Gabra Maskell's rise to power was not, however, unopposed. According to some sources, his path to the throne was almost blocked by his brother, Beta Israel. The appearance of this name, the designation used by the Falasha to refer to themselves in precisely the period in which we have suggested that the Aksumite Jews were separated, is truly a remarkable coincidence and may be much more than that. The departure of the Aksumite Jews, should we already say Beta Israel, may have been provoked by a combination of religious and political rivalry. The growing animosity between Judaism and Christianity in the kingdom might possibly have also been expressed in the struggle of rival political leaders for the throne. Beta Israel, the defeated head of the Judaized group, would then have departed with his followers to a less hospitable region, such as the Simeon. In the final analysis, it may never be possible to completely reconstruct the impact of events in the 6th century on the Jews of Aksum. As we have suggested above, it appears possible that at least some of them left the Aksum region for more isolated and peripheral regions. This move may have been part of a larger politico-religious conflicts in Aksum at the time, or it may have been a relatively isolated occurrence. What is clear is that in either case, the departure from Aksum must have had major consequences for those who left. First, although the settlement in the Simeon and other regions beyond the Takazi River would not have placed the exile beyond the political borders of the Aksumite kingdom, it would have seriously limited their contact with the political and cultural center of the Ethiopian state. Thus, for example, if their migration preceded Caleb's victory over Dunuwas, it is doubtful if they would have come into contact with any of the Judaized prisoners brought from South Arabia at that time. In the longer term, residents in such peripheral regions would have greatly limited their access to the religious and intellectual elites active in Aksum. Literary works translated from Greek to Ge'ez would have reached them slowly, if at all. Overall literacy must have declined and may even have disappeared. From a social point of view, such a migration would have greatly increased contact with the predominantly Agwa. I need to know how to pronounce that. Aga. Egu. How do you pronounce this? I thought they were going to have a pronunciation. Aga. All right, I'm just going to say Aga. All right. Where were we at? From a social point of view, such a migration would have greatly increased contact with the predominantly Aga population of the region. And the Aga are Cushitic peoples. Even during the period when they were concentrated around Aksum, the Jewish part of the population was probably not distinguishable on either a racial or ethnic basis. Rather, the relatively small number of Jewish immigrants who reached Aksum from South Arabia had almost certainly assimilated members of the surrounding population through conversion and intermarriage. These processes of intermarriage and acculturation appear to have continued in the predominantly Aga regions as well. While a significant portion of the Aga accepted Christianity, others probably embraced a more Judaized faith. While this process cannot be documented in any detail, it is noteworthy that throughout their recorded history, the Beta Israel appear closely associated with the Aga, both geographically and linguistically. Right, and again, remember the Aga are a Cushitic people. In closing, one final consequence of the departure from Axum must be considered. Thus far in this book, our attempts to reconstruct the earliest history of Jews and Judaism in Ethiopia have depended far more on our knowledge of Axumite history than on any specific data concerning its Jews. Working on the basis of hints and indirect proofs, we have tried to suggest the manner in which Jewish influences reached Ethiopia and what their impact may have been. However tentative our suggestions may have been to this point, they appear solidly based in comparison to our knowledge of Judaism in Ethiopia during the next few centuries. In part, at least, this may be due, as we have indicated, to the departure of portions of the Jewish population from Axum. Even more important, however, is the decline of the kingdom itself. All right, the decline of Axum. The reign of Caleb and his conquest on behalf of the Christian world of South Arabia marked the apex of Axumite power, prestige, and international fame. Although his successors soon lost control of South Arabia to one of their own generals, many Ethiopian traditions view the middle of the 6th century as a prosperous period that saw important developments in the evolution of both church and state. By the end of the century, however, Axum had begun a long period of decline that would eventually culminate in its abandonment and destruction. No one cause would appear to explain the fall of Axum. Rather, a variety of political, economic, social, and ecological factors combined to undermine the fragile base upon which Ethiopian civilization had risen. In the last quarter of the 6th century, the Sassanid Persians seriously challenged Ethiopian control of South Arabia. And by the turn of the century, that region had been removed from the Axumite sphere of influence. From a political perspective, the withdrawal from South Arabia marked the end of Axum's brief period as a major player on the international stage. Economically, the Persians posed a major threat to Byzantine and Axumite control of the Red Sea trade. After 602 AD, Axum's access to export markets and freedom of navigation were considerably weakened. Finally, between 702 and 715 AD, the Arabs eliminated the Axumite fleet and destroyed Attalus. This change in trading patterns, which left Axum isolated and landlocked, was a major blow to the economic basis of Axumite political power. At the same time, the rulers of Axum were encountering ever-increasing difficulties in retaining control over the hinterland regions on which they depended for export items such as wood, ivory, cattle, and gold. In the north, the Beja, that's another Cushitic tribe, a powerful pastoralist people, gained control of much of the coastal plain, which today comprises modern Eritrea. To the west, areas beyond the Takazi River, which had long been occupied and incorporated into the kingdom, regained their independence and cut off the Axumites from the main gold-bearing districts. The gold content of Axumites' coins declined steadily throughout this period, being eventually replaced by copper and in some cases silver. Deprived of the wealth generated by trade, the Axumites were increasingly forced to intensive agriculture as a means of feeding their sizable population. Soil erosion and a decline in rainfall subsequently produced a further deterioration of the region's economic base. Eventually, a large portion of the population abandoned the region in favor of more fertile lands further south. Within a few generations, so as with the gradual collapse of Axum, that's how you had gradual, large-scale migrations of people out of northern Ethiopia and Eritrea and going into southern Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, portions of Central Africa, and so forth. Okay? As Axum began to slowly collapse. The decline of Axum did not immediately result in either the disappearance of its kings or the waning of Christian influence in the highlands of Ethiopia. Numerous traditions appear to indicate that from the 7th century onward, the center of gravity of the Christian kingdom moved southward. Although it is impossible to follow this expansion of the kingdom and church in any detail, both Arabic and Ethiopian sources portray the 9th century as a time of military campaigns, church building, and even evangelizing as far south as the Amhara region. The Aksumite culture survived and even spread into regions not under its influence during its heyday. With regard to the internal history of Ethiopia, the period from the 7th to 12th century remains one of the most obscure and least understood. Hardly any contemporary sources have survived, and those that are frequently fragmented or are legendary in character. I'm skipping to the last paragraph. The obscurity that characterizes much of the Ethiopian history from the 7th century onward is only multiplied when we turn to the more specific question of Jews or Judaism during this period. Even the indirect sources of the kind used to make the tentative reconstruction suggested thus far in the book. Are you okay? All right. For the most part, lacking. We are forced, therefore, to rely on semi-legendary accounts of extremely limited historical value. Among the most important of these are the traveler reports of Eldad Hadani and Benjamin of Tudela, the letters of Prester John, and the traditions concerning Queen Judith or Yodit. All right, so now we're going to read from this. The travels to discover the source of the Nile, right? In the years 1768, 1769, 1770, 1771, 1772, and 1773 in 5 volumes by James Bruce of Kinnard, Esquire, right? Volume 1. Right, and this is from chapter 6 and chapter 8. Right, and the sections Jewish hierarchy still retained by the Fatasha, some conjectures concerning their copy of the Old Testament, and revolution under Judith, restoration of the line of Solomon from Shoah being very industrious. Right, these people multiplied exceedingly and were very powerful at the time of the conversion to Christianity, or as they term it, the apostasy under Abraha and Ataziba. At this time, they declared a prince of the tribe of Judah and of the race of Solomon and Menelik to be their sovereign. The name of this prince was Phineas, who refused to abandon the religion of his forefathers, and from him their sovereigns are lineally descended. So they have still a prince of the house of Judah, although the Abyssinians, by way of reproach, have called this family Bet Israel, imitating that they were rebels and revolted from the family of Solomon and tribe of Judah. And there is little doubt but that some of the successors of the Azarias adhere to their ancient faith also. Although there was no bloodshed upon difference of religion, yet each having a distinct king with the same pretensions, many battles were fought from motives of ambition and rivalship of sovereign power. About the year 960 AD, an attempt was made by this family to mount the throne of Abyssinia, as we shall see hereafter, when the princes of the house of Solomon were nearly extirpated upon the rock Damo. This it is they were obliged to leave the flat country of Dimbia, having no cavalry to maintain themselves there, and to take possession of the rugged and almost inaccessible rocks and that high ridge called the mountains of Saman. One of these, which nature seems to have formed for a fortress, they chose for their metropolis, and it was ever after called the Jews' Rock. A great overthrow which they received in the year 1600 brought them to the very brink of ruin. In that battle, Gideon and Judith, their king and queen, were slain. They have since adopted a more peaceful and dutiful behavior, pay taxes, and are suffered to enjoy their own government. Their king and queen's name was again Gideon and Judith when I was in Abyssinia, and these names seem to be preferred for those of the royal family. At that time, they were supposed to amount to 100,000 effective men, something like this. The sober and most knowing Abyssinians are obliged to allow to be truth, but the circumstances of the conversion from Judaism are probably not all before us. The only copy of the Old Testament which they have is in Ge'ez, the same made use of by the Abyssinian Christians, who are the only scribes and sell these copies to the Jews. And it is very singular that no controversy or dispute about the text has ever yet arisen between the professors of the two religions. They have no corrective or various readings. They never heard of Talmud, Targum, or Kabbalah. Neither have they any fringes or ribbon upon their garments, nor is there, as far as I can learn, one scribe among them. So they didn't wear fringes, right? They didn't wear fringes. They didn't use the Talmud, right? No Mishnah. All right. I asked him, being from Judea, whence they got that language which they spoke, whether it was one of the languages of the nations which they had learned on the coast of the Red Sea. They apprehended, but it was mere conjecture, that the language which they spoke was that of those nations they had found on the Red Sea. After their leaving Judea and settling there, and the reason they gave was certainly a pertinent one, that they came into Abyssinia speaking Hebrew, with the advantage of having books in that language. But they had now forgot their Hebrew, and it was therefore not probable they should retain any other language in which they had no books, and which they never had learned to express by letters. I asked them, since they came from Jerusalem, how it happened that they had not Hebrew or Samaritan copies of the law, at least the Pentateuch or Octiac. They said they were in possession of both when they came from Jerusalem, but their fleet being destroyed in the reign of Rehoboam and communication becoming very uncertain by the Syrian wars, they were from necessity obliged to have the scriptures translated or make use of the copies in the hands of the shepherds, who according to them before Solomon's time were all Jews. They deny the scepter has ever departed from Judah, as they have a prince of that house reigning, and understand the prophecy of the gathering of the Gentiles at the coming of Shiloh. All right, so notice here, they said there were already Jews there when they got there. And this is back during like King Solomon's time, when they're describing when they first got there. And they were shepherds, and a lot of them were shepherds. But then they also said the reason why they ended up not being able to speak Hebrew no more, and you know how that question comes up sometimes. People will be like, well, how come these people don't speak Hebrew no more? How did that happen? They said they lost the ability to speak Hebrew and to be able to write in Hebrew after the northern and southern kingdom split, and during the time of Rehoboam, and they lost communications. And then when they got too involved, when Israel was getting into too many wars with Syria or Aram Damascus, they weren't able to stay in communication with them. So they ended up losing that connection. All right. It is to be fulfilled on the appearance of the Messiah, who has not yet come, when all the inhabitants of the world are to be Jews. All right. And I have what they just said there. I actually have one of my ancestors' slave narratives. He says the same exact thing. Where it says here is to be fulfilled on the appearance of the Messiah, who has not yet come, when all the inhabitants of the world are to be Jews. All right. Judith have made, so notice here, when this European who was amongst them in the 1700s and documenting their beliefs, these Jews in Ethiopia, they told him that they believe Christ is going to come back, right? Either for some, it's going to be either for the first time, because they don't believe in the first coming, or it'll be the second coming for those that believed in the second coming and believe in the truth, the full Old and New Testament, and that he's going to gather the people. Right. And in the end, everybody's going to have to be Jews. Right. Because in the end, everybody's going to have to keep Sabbath, keep all the commandments during Christ's 1,000-year reign. They're going to have to do all of that. Keep the feast days, okay? Judith had made so strong a party that she resolved to attempt the subversion of the Christian religion, and with it the succession in the line of Solomon. The children of the royal family were at this time, in virtue of the old law, confined on the almost inaccessible mountain of Damo in Tigray. The short reign, sudden and unexpected death of the late King Azor, and the desolation of the contagion, which an epidemical disease has spread both in court and capital, the weak state of Delnad, who was to succeed Azor and was an infant, all these circumstances together impressed Judith with an idea that now was the time to place her family upon the throne and establish her religion by the expatriation of the race of Solomon. Accordingly, she surprised the Amahara upon the first news of the catastrophe at Damo, conveyed the infant King Delnad, now the only remaining prince of his race, into the powerful and loyal province of Shoa, and by this means the royal family was preserved to be again restored. Judith took possession of the throne in defiance of the law of the Queen of Saba. By this, the first interruption of the succession in the line of Solomon, and contrary to what might have been expected from the violent means she had used to acquire the crown, she not only enjoyed it herself during a long reign of 40 years, but transmitted it also to 5 of her posterity, all of them barbarous names originating probably in Lasta. These are said to be Totedim, Janshum, Gurim, Shum, Herbai, Merari, authors, as well Abyssinian as European have differed widely about the duration of these reigns. All that the Abyssinians are agreed upon is that this whole period was one scene of murder, violence, and oppression. Judith and her descendants were succeeded by relations of their own, a noble family of Lasta. The history of this revolution or cause of it are lost and unknown in the country, and therefore vainly fought after elsewhere. What we know is that with them the court returned to the Christian religion, and that they were still as different from their predecessors in manners as in religion. Though usurpers as were the others, their names are preserved with every mark of respect and veneration. They are Tekla Hamano, Kedus Harbi, Ita Barak, Lalibela, Imerhana, Christos, Nox, I don't know how to pronounce, Nakuito, Lab. Not being kings of the line of Solomon, no part of their history is recorded in the annals unless that of Lalibela, who lived in the end of the 12th or beginning of the 13th century and was a saint. The whole period of usurpation, comprehending the long reign of Judith, will by this account be a little more than 300 years, in which time 11 princes are said to have sat upon the throne of Solomon, so that supposing her death to have been in the year 1000, each of these princes at an average will have been a little more than 24 years, and this is too much. But all this period is involved in darkness, we might guess, but since we are not able to do more, it answers no good purpose to do so much. In all this time, the line of Solomon had been continued from Delnad, who we have seen it had escaped from the massacre of Damo under Judith. Content with possessing the loyal province of Shoa, they continued their royal residence there without having made one attempt, as far as history tells us, towards recovering their ancient kingdom. All right, these are from my notes. All right, on Judith. Judith was an Israelitish queen mother who flourished circa 960 AD, laying waste to Axum or Zuma and its countryside, destroyed churches and monuments, and attempted to exterminate the members of the ruling dynasty of the kingdom of Axum. Her deeds are recorded in the oral tradition and mentioned incidentally in various historical accounts. After Axum destroyed Meroe in the 4th century AD and converted to Byzantine Christianity, the Israelites of Ethiopia fought them and established their own kingdom. This kingdom has been referred to as the kingdom of the Gideons, land of the Jews, and kingdom of the Phalasha throughout the ages. Around the 10th century, a Jewish king conquered Axum with help from the Cushitic Aga people. After this, the Zagwe dynasty was established over Axum with the Aga ruling. During this time, many Cushitic Aga would convert to the religion and customs of the Jews. The false Solomonic line from Axum/Sheba would not be restored until the 13th century. After this restoration and subsequent attacks, many Israelites migrated to Central Africa, other parts of East Africa's interior south, like Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, and eastern portions of the DRC. They formed their own states while others settled in neighboring kingdoms. Right? And here I have a reference. According to Asrua, the Kikuyu of Kenya came from Abasi in Abyssinia, who belonged to the tribe of Judah and migrated passing through Meru, thereby settling and multiplying at Makuri, Wagatanga. From there, they further dispersed, right? And I have the source there for that. And then I also have there the reference to look at the lessons we did on the Kikuyu, the Meru, and the one we did on the Yoruba, because the one we did on the Yoruba, we deal with the Hammurati kingdom and the battles going back and forth between them and Axum, because that relates to the Yoruba and their migration into West Africa. Trying to see one other thing to point out. So also notice here with the Kikuyu and talking about them coming from the tribe of Judah, migrating into Kenya, all right, and coming out of Ethiopia. All right, you have lots of Bantu groups, same thing, with the same type of story. All right, because you have lots of people migrating out of Axum gradually as it was crumbling. We were talking about that earlier. So you had lots of people migrating out from like the 5th century, 6th century, 7th century, and 8th century. And then then even after that, you have people migrating still out of Ethiopia, but it was to a lesser degree. It didn't pick up again to a higher degree till probably about the 14 or 1500s. All right. At the time Zara Jacob assumed the throne, the Ethiopian church had been divided over the issue of biblical Sabbath observance for roughly a century. One group loyal to the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria believed that the day of rest should be observed only on Sunday. Another group, the followers of Awastewos, believed with their founder that both the original seventh-day Sabbath and Sunday should be observed. He was successful in persuading two recently arrived Egyptian Abuna, Michael and Gabriel, into accepting a compromise aimed at restoring harmony with the house of Iwastewos, as the followers of Iwastewos were known. At the same time, he made efforts to pacify the house of Iwastewos, while the Iwastathians were won over to the compromise by 1442. The two Abuns only agreed to the compromise at the Council of Debri, Micmac, and Tigulet in 1450. All right, so we're going to look again at this, the Historical Dictionary of Ethiopia, 2nd edition. All right. Although many Ethiopian Orthodox churches' practices are similar to those of the Greek Orthodox Church, there are differences. There are Judaic features in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which retains the distinction between clean and unclean meats, priestly dances with drums, and reverence for Saturday, the Sabbath, as well as for Sunday. So notice here, you can still see the legacy of this even in the modern Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where a lot of them keep the dietary law. They go to church on Sabbath and Sunday, and they keep Sabbath, right? All right. So each Ethiopian Orthodox Church possesses a so-called Ark of the Covenant. This is similar to the Ark of a Jewish synagogue where the Torah is kept. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church practices circumcision 8 days after birth as a local custom rather than a religious rite. All right, Iwastewos. who lived from 1273 AD to 1352 AD. Okay. And I can never pronounce that. Tigrayan monastic evangelist who advocated spiritual independence and isolation from corrupting state influences. To advance his religious beliefs, Iwastewos established a community as Sere and expected his followers to grow their own food, a significant departure from the traditional practice whereby clerics received sustenance from the peasantry. He also accused the secular clergy of loose morality, condemned Christians who engaged in slavery, and abolished animistic and pagan religious practices and ceremonies. Followers of Iwastewos celebrated the Sabbath on Saturday and Sunday, a custom that brought them into conflict with the traditional Ethiopian clerics and the Alexandrian patriarch. His opponents, relying on the Alexandrian church's 13th century anathematization of the Old Testament customs, subsequently declared him a deviant. In about 1337, Iwastewos fled to Cyprus, Jerusalem, and Egypt, and finally settled in Armenia, where he died. His followers remained in Ethiopia and moved to remote border regions to avoid persecution by church officials. Their monasteries and communities flourished and built Debri Bizan in Hamasyan and Gunda Gunde in northwest Tigray. Dawit I sought to suppress the Iwastewians by jailing some of their leaders. The emperor's strategy failed as the Iwastewians formed a mass movement against the established order. In 1403, Dawit I freed those who had been incarcerated and decreed that the Iwastewans were free to celebrate their Sabbath if they abandoned their confrontational tactics. Dawit I's successor, Zara Yaqub, continued a policy of cooperation. In 1450, he supervised the Council of Debri Mitmak in Shoa province, which resolved the conflict with the Iwastewians by authorizing them to observe the Sabbath on Saturday and Sunday. In turn, the Iwastewians accepted the holy orders and episcopal discipline. All right, this is from Encyclopedia Britannica on Iwastewos. Okay. Ethiopian saint and founder of one of the two great Ethiopian monastic communities. Iwastewos and his disciples respected the traditional Judaic customs of the Ethiopian church concerning the Sabbath and impure meats, and held the view that the anointing of Jesus after his death brought about a fusion of his human and divine natures, one of the fundamental doctrinal points of monophysitism. The belief in a single divine nature of Christ, which is the foundation of the Ethiopian church. Iwastewos, all right, so notice here, he was also about, besides just the Sabbath, he was doing a movement in East Africa at the time in the 1300s, also to get people to keep the dietary law too. Okay. A zealous pilgrim, Iwastewos was a destroyer of tribal shrines and sought to remove the vestiges of pre-Christian practice remaining in the Ethiopian church. A zealous pilgrim, he visited Alexandria, Jerusalem, Cyprus, and Armenia. During Iwastewos' life, his disciples founded many monasteries, the greatest of which were at Kisichi, north of Axum, and at Bizan, near modern Asmara, Eritrea. The Bizan monastery undertook leadership of the northern monks, remaining faithful to the Judaic observances, even when these fell into disfavor and resulted in the persecution from emperors and ecclesiastical authorities. Eustathian monasteries were persecuted until 1404, but circa 1450 they were recognized as orthodox by the Ethiopian church. Iwastewos preached isolation from corrupting state influences and a return to biblical teachings, including observance of the Judaic Sabbath on Saturday, in addition to the Sunday observance, an idea apparently already widely diffused in Ethiopia. The great emperor Zara Yaqub reigned, letting you know the concept of keeping Sabbath was widely adhered to already at that time in Ethiopia, conceded the latter point in 1450 at the Council of Debri-Mitmac, but he also initiated severe reforms in the church, eliminating abuses by strong measures and executing the leaders of heretical sects. Zara Yaqub also conducted an unsuccessful military campaign against the Beta Israel, a group of Agha-speaking Jews who practice a non-Talmudic form of Judaism. Right? This one is from EthiopianHistory.com on Iwa Stewos. Iwa Stewos was a Tigrian monastic evangelist who lived from 1273 to 1352. In his missionary, he attempted to abolish pagan animistic religions and ceremonial observances. He is well known for having uprooted 12 sanctified groves of trees devoted to pagan gods. Said to be the nephew of Abba Daniel, all right, sanctified groves of trees, that's Ashtoreth, that's that ancient Canaanite religion, right? He was well known for having uprooted 12 sanctified groves of trees devoted to pagan gods. Said to be a nephew of Abba Daniel of Geralta, Iwa Stewos founded a vibrant monastic community in Serah. In his teachings, he urged his followers to make their own food. He forbade them from taking donations from nobles. He commanded Christian rulers who were he condemned Christian rulers who were involved with the slave trade, and he advocated the teaching of Christ. At the time, the Ethiopian church, as well as the representative of the Alexandrian patriarch, were opposed to observing the Sabbath on Saturday. Iwa Stewos and most Tigrians, however, preferred to observe the Sabbath on Saturday and Sunday. The conflicting view between Iwa Stewos and the church led him to leave the country around 1338. He went to Cyprus, Jerusalem, Egypt, and finally settled in Armenia until his death. Iwa Stewos' followers, upon their return to Ethiopia, were forced to settle in distant border regions to avoid the wrath of the main church. His followers built Debri Bizan in Hamasyan and Gunda Gunde in northeast Tigray. Iwa Stewian followers were persecuted and secluded until the reign of Dawit in 1404. Emperor Zara Yaqub in 1450 supervised the Council of Debri-Mitmac in Shuwa and finally resolved the conflict by accepting to observe Sabbath on Saturday and Sunday. Francisco Alvarez was a chaplain priest and almonger to King Emmanuel of Portugal. He was sent in 1515 as part of the Portuguese embassy to the Negus Negus, Emperor of Ethiopia. Accompanied by the Ethiopian ambassador Matthias, their first attempt to reach the port of Massawa failed due to the actions of Lopa Soares de Albugarra, governor of Portuguese India, which got no closer than the Dahlak archipelago and was aborted with the death of the Portuguese ambassador Old Duarte Galvo at Cameron. Alvarez and Matthias were forced to wait until the arrival of Soares' replacement, Diogo Lopez de Sequeira, who successfully sent the embassy on with Don Rodrigo de Lima, replacing Duarte Galvo. The party at last reached Massawa on April 9, 1520, and reached the court of Lebna Dingel, where he befriended several Europeans who had gained the favor of the emperor, which included Pero da Cova and Niccolo Brancilion. Father Alvarez remained 6 years in Ethiopia, returning to Lisbon in either 1526 or 1527. In 1533, he was allowed to accompany Dom Martinho de Portugal to Rome on an embassy to Pope Clement VII, to whom Father Alvarez delivered the letter Lebna Dingo had written to the Pope. The precise date of Francisco Alvarez's death, like that of his birth, is unknown, but the writer of the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica article concludes it was later than 1540, in which year an account of his travels were published at Lisbon. In the introduction of their translation of Alvarez's work, C.F. Beckingham and G.W.B. Huntingford furnish evidence that points to Alvarez's death in Rome and admit that he may have died before his work was published. Did I go too far? It looks like I did. All right. Sabbath on Saturday rather than Sunday. In his biography, he later told how he became quite intimate with the bishop and with the emperor. He, in fact, boasted of accomplishing the following great deeds. When first he came to the country, according to his own account 50 years ago, but his chronology is contradictory and confused, he had been a zealous reformer and had persuaded the then king to forbid the keeping of the Sabbath and the avoidance of pork and unclean meat. But the native clergy had won the day. So notice here, there's a European who came over, who was in the Ethiopian king's court. He was trying to persuade him to stop keeping Sabbath and to persuade him to make the people to stop keeping Sabbath and to make the people to start eating pork and to stop keeping the dietary law. Right? Now, but the native clergy had won the day, for they pointed out that Branceleon and Decovian, who had gone native, observed the Mosaic law and argued that it must be the universal law of the church if even Franks observed it. All right, so they pointed out that some of these other Europeans who have come here, they've gone native there, keeping the Mosaic law like the rest of us here. And they're like, so no, we're not going to go over to your way. You need to come over to our way. All right. Alvarez says repeatedly that their company was obliged on the weekends to observe Shabbat while in Eastern Africa. After we had seen it all, the monks were much embarrassed because it was the Sabbath and they could not prepare us something to eat. So they asked us to pardon them, for they could only give us of what they had in the house. All right, that was from the Historia de Ethiopia, or History of Ethiopia, page 53, written circa 1521 AD. They tell that there was an emperor in Ethiopia who commanded that the Sabbath should not be kept in his kingdoms and dominions, and that this Philip went to him, taking along his books and friars, to show the king that God had commanded that the Sabbath be kept, and that those who would not keep it were to be stoned. I'm going to read this again. They tell that there was an emperor in Ethiopia who commanded that the Sabbath should not be kept in his kingdoms and dominions, and that this Philip went to him, taking along his books and friars, to show the king that God had commanded that the Sabbath be kept, and that those who would not keep it were to be stoned. This he debated and defended before all the fathers of Ethiopia, and he made it seem good to the emperor. For this they say he is a saint. All right. A clergyman was sent in 1534 from Ethiopia to Portugal for aid against the Muslims, and the Portuguese king sent immediately 450 soldiers who rendered effective aid to the Ethiopians. John Bermudez, a priest who accompanied the expedition, has left an account of this in Portuguese. The Ethiopian ambassador to Portugal gave this as an explanation for the observance of the Sabbath in his country. We observe the Sabbath day because God, after he had finished the creation of the world, rested thereon, which day he would have called the Holy of the Holies. If with great honor and devotion this day is not celebrated, it should clearly be seen to be against the will and law of him who would rather that heaven and earth should perish than have his word to fail. Especially so since Christ came not to destroy the law, but to magnify it. Hence we observe the Sabbath, not in imitation of the Jews, but according to the law of our Lord Jesus Christ and of the holy apostles. All right, so notice here, this Ethiopian, this East African in the 1500s is telling this European dude why he keeps the Sabbath. And he's telling him the same thing, that for the same thing we say. He quoted the same scriptures we say to like family and friends and people we trying to tell. read the Bible to that you still need to keep the command, you still need to keep the Sabbath, and they'll be like, oh, that's been done away with. Don't we go into Matthew and where we talk about where Jesus says not one tittle or one jot of the law will pass away, right? And that he didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it, right? So I'm going to read this again. All right. A clergyman was sent in 1534 from Ethiopia to Portugal for aid against the Muslims. And the Portuguese king sent immediately 450 soldiers who rendered effective aid to the Ethiopians. John Bermudez, a priest who accompanied the expedition, has left an account of this in Portuguese. The Ethiopian ambassador to Portugal gave this as an explanation for the observance of the Sabbath in his country. We observe the Sabbath day because God, after he had finished the creation of the world, rested thereon, which day he would have called the Holy of the Holies. If with great honor and devotion this day is not celebrated, it should clearly be seen to be against the will and law of him who would rather that heaven and earth should perish than have his word to fail. Especially so, since Christ came not to destroy the law, but to magnify it. Hence we observe the Sabbath not in imitation of the Jews, but according to the law of our Lord Jesus Christ and of the holy apostles. Right? And that was from De Rebus Ethiopius concerning Ethiopian affairs. He even added the other thing we say. You know how like we'll read the feast days in Leviticus 23 and we'll be like, to see it says it's the Lord's feast. It's not the feast of the Jews. It's the Lord's feast, right? It's not the Jewish Sabbath. It's the Lord's Sabbath. The Sabbath was instituted before there was even a Jew on the planet Earth, right? So now we're going back to this book, The Beta Israel in Ethiopia, from the earliest times to the 20th century by Steve Kaplan. Of the nearby Sakana Amba, the emperor, however, quickly regrouped. Do I need to read that top part? I probably just want this bottom part. Yeah, the bottom part. No, we'll read it. All right, I'm going to pick it up at the top. Beta Israel were heavy. Losses among Beta Israel were heavy, and the emperor alone is said to have received almost 200 widows and numerous orphans as part of his share of the captives. According to a tradition preserved by the Ethiopian church, so much blood was spilt when Sarsa Dingle had the Beta Israel killed that his tent had to be moved 3 times to avoid being soiled by it. Work Amba was speedily subdued, and by the end of January 1588, Gushan and many of his supporters had died, flinging themselves to their deaths from the heights of their fortresses. Rather mysteriously, Gedawan, an important member of the Beta Israel ruling family, escaped unharmed. Despite the ferocity that characterized Sarsa Dingle's 3 campaigns against the Beta Israel, his victories do not appear to have produced any dramatic long-term changes in the status of the Beta Israel. The loss of life, enslavement, and forced conversions must all have been severe blows for the surviving population. Moreover, the settlement of some of the victorious troops in the region probably increased Beta Israel's financial burden and fostered resentment. They did not, however, lose their autonomy in the Simeon region for long and even received official confirmation of their position in the province following the death of Sarsa Dingle in 1597. Mariam Sina, the wife of Sarsa Dingle, bore the emperor 3 daughters, but no sons. As a result, he designated Zindigel, the son of his brother, Lesna Christos, as his heir. Sometime later, however, he changed his mind and came to favor Zamrian, his son by his Beta Israel mistress Harago. When Zamrian died shortly after his introduction to the court, Sarsa Dingle reinstated his nephew as his presumptive heir. The birth of another son, Jacob, to Harago in 59 produced yet another change of mind, with the advantage falling once again to the half Beta Israel son. Jacob was only 7 years old when his father died, and he was crowned as emperor. The selection of this small boy, rather than the older and abler Zeningel, was less a reflection of a desire to comply with the late emperor's choice of an heir than a shrewd political move on the part of the nobles, the warlords, and the empress Mariam Sina. By placing Jacob on the throne as regent, they were able to retain their hold on the reins of power. Zenigel was sent into exile on the island in Lake Tana, although Jacob's mother, Harago, received no official position at court. Her brother, Gedouan, was confirmed as governor of Simeon. Not surprisingly, no serious attempt was made to challenge Jacob's rule during the 7 years of his regency. However, when he decided in 1603 at age 14 to actively assume power, the coalition of groups who had placed him on the throne had little interest in seeing him discard his role as figurehead. Because of his youth, moreover, he had neither led nor won the loyalty of the various royal military families, who were chafing at the relatively long period of inactivity. This combined lack of experience, allies, and trustworthy advisors made it easy for Mariam Sina and the nobles to overthrow Jacob and replace him on the throne with Zenigel. Although Jacob tried to escape to his uncle Gedouan in Simeon, he was captured and placed on trial for usurpation. Jacob was charged with being a pagan, a practitioner of Oromo divination techniques, a sexual deviant, all right, and the Oromo, that's another Cushitic group, a sexual deviant and not the son of Sarsa Dingle. How much his half Beta Israel antecedents influenced the proceedings is difficult to reckon. Certainly the fact that in his moment of need he turned to his uncle, the ruler of the Beta Israel of Simeon, would appear to indicate that his link to his maternal kin remained strong. The charge of paganism, moreover, while a common accusation in Ethiopian court intrigues, may have also been based on his non-Christian background. Before the proceedings against Jacob had reached their obviously preordained conclusion, Zenigel intervened. Rather than being maimed or disfigured, which have permanently ended his political ambitions, Jacob was sent into exile in Inaria. Zenigel became emperor at age 26 and assumed the throne name of Galawadiwos. He was an honest, courageous, and educated ruler who made a serious attempt to rectify some of the damage caused by the neglect and errors of his predecessors. He tried, for example, to stop the advance of the Gala by leading his troops into Gojan. He also made a serious attempt to curtail the power of the nobility and reassert imperial authority. This latter program, which included the creation of a powerful king's army and the arming of the peasantry, ultimately led to his downfall, as noted above, already in 1597. The nobles and the empress Mariam Sina had placed Jacob on the throne because they feared that Zenigel would limit their freedom of action. When their worst fears were confirmed, they wasted little time in acting. Some sought to restore Jacob to the throne. Others favored the aspirations of the warrior chief Susenyos, who, as a great-grandson of the emperor Lebna Dingle, could legitimately stake claim to the throne. Not surprisingly, Zenigel received little support from either the nobility or the military elites. His assiduous courting of the Portuguese, including a ban on the observance of the Saturday Sabbath and an offer to convert to Catholicism, lost him much popular support. All right, so that was like the final straw for them when they were like, all right, man, now you're going to try to convert us to Catholicism, and now you're going to try to outlaw us from keeping the Sabbath. All right, no. All right, we're going to put an end to this. All right, so they said here, it says here, including a ban on the observance of Saturday Sabbath and an offer to convert to Catholicism, lost him much popular support. Eventually, the Abuna absolved the population of their oath allegiance to the monarch and excommunicated him. In October 1604, a little more than a year after assuming power, Zenigel was killed by Dimbaya, by rebel forces. Although Susenyos appeared assured of the throne and was backed by much of the nobility and the army, his support largely evaporated when Jacob reappeared. Once again, the nobility and warlords sought to place on the throne the younger and weaker candidate. Susanios was forced to flee and become a shifta, or bandit. Yakab sought to appease him by offering him the governorship of Shawa, Amahara, and Walakwa. Susanios, however, viewed himself as the legitimate heir and saw little reason to settle for a secondary role. He was, moreover, an excellent general and skilled tactician. In March 1607, following 2 years of turmoil, he defeated and killed Yakub and claimed the throne. More than a decade of succession struggles provided the Beta Israel with an extended respite from the wars against the Ethiopian emperors. From 1597 to 1607, all the contenders for the throne had more important matters to deal with than the fate of the residents of Simeon and Dimbaya. Yakub's death and the rise of Susanios, moreover, did not immediately result in a universally accepted monarch assuming the throne. Rival claimants and disgruntled nobles continued to plague Susanios throughout the early years of his reign. One of the most serious was a Tigrian monk who, hiding his face in a veil, claimed to be the half-Beta Israel Emperor Yakub. Large parts of the population, including the prestigious monastery at Debre Bazan, supported him, and Susanios was forced to lead his troops to Tigray and personally subdue the rebel. While there, he took the opportunity to give himself crowned yet again, this time in the ancient Ethiopian capital of Aksum. While Susanios was occupied with the Tigrian challenge to his reign, large parts of Bagmadir, Wagara, and Damaya rose up in support of Arzo, a grandson of Minias. The emperor's brother, Yimna Christos, put down that threat. The revival of imperial interest in Beta Israel of Simeon was directly related to the numerous challenges of Susanios' rule. In 1614, the dispossessed nobility of Salamat, Wagara, and Simeon rose up in support of yet another pretender to the throne, claiming to be the late Emperor Yakub. Among the supporters of Yakub, who is identified in the Ge'ez sources as Taklu and by Bruce as Amdo, was Gedawan, leader of the Beta Israel of Simeon. When Taklu was captured by Walda Hamarat, the governor of Salamat, Gedawan freed him and offered him refuge in the mountains of Simeon. From there, Taklu was able to raise a large army and challenge royal control of much of the surrounding territory by raiding the plains of Shuwada and Salamat. In response, Susanios appointed Yoyos, the husband of his favorite daughter, one of his most loyal followers, and until then the governor of Tigray, as governor of Wagra, Simeon, Salamat, Wag, as well as the southern parts of Tigray. Yoyos promised to subdue the rebels, saying, "I shall vanquish and kill this pretender Gedawan, the Falasha, and plant onions on Siganet." Despite Yoyos' boasting, his troops were not immediately successful, and he was forced to ask the emperor to personally intervene after Taklu killed Abraham, the governor of Salamat. Marching from Wagara to Simeon, Susanios joined Yolos and laid siege to the Beta Israel fortress at Amba Misraba. Their soldiers conquered the Amba and killed all its inhabitants. A similar fate awaited those Beta Israel who sought refuge on an Amba called Hach. Finally, Gedawan and Taklu were surrounded at Siganet. For 2 months, Susanios' troops laid siege to the Amba, inflicting heavy losses on its defenders. Gedawan himself was only saved by the bravery of one of his chiefs, Wad Quamatra, who was killed by a musketeer. Finally, Gedawan handed Taklu over to the emperor in exchange for a pardon and peace. The false Yakub was crucified as punishment for his rebellion. In punishment for the support they offered his rival, Susanios ordered the governors to massacre the Beta Israel men wherever they found them. Their wives and children were sold into slavery. Only a few escaped. The Beta Israel of Dambaya and perhaps others who had not participated in the rebellion were spared on condition that they converted to Christianity. Indeed, Susanios is said to have spent the whole of the rainy season of Gorga on the northwest shore of Lake Tana in order to ensure compliance with his decree. Virtually all of them complied. As a test of their sincerity, the emperor demanded that they plow their fields on the Sabbath. All right, so finally, when they were able to destroy this kingdom of this Jewish or Israelite kingdom in East Africa, they sold most of the people off into slavery. Those that survived, that they allowed to survive, were forced to convert to Christianity, and as a test to prove that they're forced to convert to Sunday Christianity, and as a test to prove that they truly converted, they wanted them to do work on the Sabbath or break the Sabbath as a test to show that you are not lying about converting, right? Susanyo's pronouncements are of interest in several respects. First, they clearly indicate that even prior to their final defeat, the Beta Israel were geographically dispersed and politically divided. In addition to the two large concentrations of Beta Israel in Dambaya and Simeon, smaller groups, perhaps not even organized communities, existed in a number of other regions. Only a small portion of these appear to have followed Gedeon in supporting the pretender Takalu/Yekav's aspirations to the throne. Second, Susanyo's policies appear to indicate a clear departure from previous attempts to deal with the Beta Israel. While earlier rulers, including Yishak and Menes, have sought to impose Christianity on the Beta Israel, wholesale extermination outside the heat of battle had not previously been attempted. Moreover, with the exception of Menas' ill-advised attempt to force the Beta Israel to convert, the emperors had usually been satisfied with professions of political loyalty and prompt payments of tribute. Susanyo's decrees mark a dramatic attempt to settle once and for all the problem of the Beta Israel. Despite the severity of his proposals, their impact on the Beta Israel was almost certainly less than one might initially expect. Susanyo's control of his realm was never very strong, and it is probable that in many regions, local rulers simply chose to ignore his edicts. The continued survival of the Beta Israel of Simeon is the most obvious evidence that Susanyo's call for their extermination was not completely carried out. In other regions, the demand that the Beta Israel labor on the Sabbath must have been especially problematic. The issue of the Saturday Sabbath had long been a bone of contention within the Ethiopian church and between the Ethiopian Christians and the Portuguese Jesuits. The Tigrian Jacob, who challenged Susanyo's early in his reign, drew much of his support from the traditionally pro-Sabbath monastery of Dabra Bazan. Moreover, Susanyos, like Zanengel before him, has sought to remedy the weakness of his internal position by relying increasingly on the Portuguese for support. Gradually, he also moved toward his own personal conversion. By the time Susanyo sought to quash the rebellion of 1614, relations with the Orthodox clergy had deteriorated to such an extent that they withheld their support for his campaign. In this context, Susanyo's prohibition of Sabbath rest for the Beta Israel can scarcely be viewed as simply a demand for a visible sign for their conversion. To many Orthodox Christians, Sabbath labor was an anathema, and Susanyo's demands must have increased their concerns regarding his attitude toward their own observance. The singling out of so problematic an issue for the Beta Israel may moreover raise legitimate questions as to which church the emperor sought to incorporate them. It is also against the background of the internal religious divisions that plagued Ethiopia during his reign that we must understand Susanyo's continued difficulties with Gedeon and the Beta Israel. In 1617, Yoyos, the king's son-in-law and hitherto loyal supporter, joined a group of nobles, courtiers, and the Abuna in an attempt to overthrow Susanyos and his Catholic younger brother, Sela Christos. Both Yoyos and the Abuna died in battle. Far from serving as a warning to Susanyos, His victory in 1607 merely made him even more determined to establish Catholicism as the state religion. In June 1620, he issued a proclamation condemning the Ethiopian church's alleged monophysite theology and prohibiting the observance of the Sabbath. Although the initial response to these decrees came from the clergy of Tigray, by the fall, a far more widespread opposition had surfaced. In October 1620, Yonael, the governor of Bagmadir, who had himself played a crucial role in quelling the rebellion of 1617, declared himself a defender of the Orthodox Church. In the same month, a popular uprising of the peasants in Damat further demonstrated the depth of feeling surrounding their issues. Not to be deterred, Susenyos publicly converted to Catholicism in March 1622 and began a wholesale transformation of the ties between the church and state. By 1624, vast areas of Ethiopian custom were under attack, including the right to divorce, the tradition of weekly fast, and the observance of biblical dietary laws. The hours of Mass and other services followed the practice of the Catholic Church and the Gregorian. Did I go too far? And I just stopped there. And it would be the Gregorian calendar. All right, we can stop there. All right. So now we're going to look at my notes. But basically what you saw there was up until the 1600s, you had in the 1500s and 1600s, you had this strong internal conflict in Ethiopia where you had some kings who wanted to latch on to the Europeans and in doing so that they can get Portuguese help and other European groups help. So they wanted to convert to Catholicism. But the majority of the people living in Ethiopia at that time and in those parts of East Africa that was under their influence did not want to convert to Catholicism. And one of the biggest sticking points was the Sabbath. And so at first, finally, when he got tired of and this was something that was going on as we read what Iwa Stewos in Ethiopia from the 1300s to the 1600s, going back and forth on this issue of Sabbath. And so this last king we were just reading about, he went out on a mission to try to exterminate all the Jews or Israelites out of Ethiopia, but he was unsuccessful. And one of the ways he would show mercy on them was if they converted to Sunday Christianity or basically Catholicism. And the way they showed proof of that was by having them pollute the Sabbath, right? And so, but then that ended up pissing off the Ethiopian Orthodox Christians in Ethiopia, because even though they went to church on Sunday, they kept Sabbath too. So they were like, so what are you saying? You get what I'm saying? All right. So this is from my notes. All right. So meanwhile, because we just spent a lot of time dealing with Ethiopia. Meanwhile, around this time, circa 1600 AD, the rest of East Africa's civilizations were engaged in the following: Somalia, Mogadishu, the center of a thriving weaving industry known as Tu Benadir, specialized for the markets in Egypt and Syria, together with Marka and Barawa, also in Somalia, served as transit stops for Bantu Swahili merchants from Mombasa and Malindi, Kenya, and for the gold trade from Kilwa, Tanzania. Jewish merchants from the Hormuz also brought their Indian textile and fruit to the Somali and Swahili coast in exchange for grain and wood. Many of the Jewish merchants settled in these areas as well. All right, and I have some sources there for that. I think I put it in there twice. But the Arabian Seas, the Indian Ocean world of the 17th century, right? Some form of Sabbath keeping was still a common practice throughout East Africa, even into the 1600s. Sabbath keeping in the area decreased in correlation to increased European influence and our control, culminating after the Berlin Conference of 1884. So basically, you see the gradual decrease of Sabbath observance in East Africa has a direct correlation with European influence and European contact. As more and more European influence starts to develop in East Africa, the less Sabbath keeping you see in East Africa. All right. So this is Bantu, Gala, and Somali migrations in the Horn of Africa, a reassessment of the Juba. All right. Source, the Journal of African History, Volume 16, Number 4, 1975, published by Cambridge University Press. Okay. To arguing that Bantu speakers must have been at Brava too, nor does the survival of a Swahili dialect at Brava, Merka, and Mogadishu called Chimbalizi tell us very much. One of the most commonest features of the history of the east coast of Africa is the migration of small groups of traders from one port to another. And Chimbalizi seems to be spoken by small autonomous communities of Marani merchants and sailors, said to be descendants of a group of Israelites who fled from southern Arabia. All right, so you have these Bantu groups still even in Somalia today, right, who descend from these traders and merchants, right, who came from them city-states along the southeastern African coast, like Tanzania and Kenya, right, who know they Israel, know they Israelites, right, and establish themselves in these coastal cities in Somalia, right? Moving forward. This is from Peoples of the Horn of Africa, Somali, Afar, and Saho, Northeastern Africa, Part 1, Ethnographic Survey of Africa, right? Section on Swahili-speaking coastal peoples. The Amarani are an autonomous community found at Brava and in Merka, Mogadishu, and Afgoy. They appear in part to have come from South Arabia and may perhaps be descendants of an Israelite group which fled from Arabia at the time of the first expansion of Islam. Physically, they resemble the Ethiopic type, but have more developed Caucasoid affinities. Most Amarani are merchants and sailors, and incongruously enough speak a Swahili dialect, Hamarani Chimbalizi. Cerulli compares this Barava city language to the Semitic city language of Harar. Its isolated occurrence demonstrates he considers the presence of Bantu in this region at an early date. Their relations with the Arab and Somali settlers who followed them is, however, obscure. Okay, this is from the Danish Immigration Service report on minority groups in Somalia. Okay, the Ili. According to Mr. Farah Omari Muhammad, a representative of the Ili community in Nairobi, the Ili centuries ago had their own kingdom ruled by King Jidi Adabo around the hill Bur Ili, close to Bur Hakaba Bay region. The Ili were hunters and agro-pastoralists. They believed themselves to be of Falasha or Jewish origin before they were Islamicized. They were treated by the main Somali clans as religious outcasts. Farah Umari Muhammad said that before the war, there were some 1,000 Ili families living scattered throughout southern Somalia, up to and including the Haran region. But the majority lived in two districts, Bulu Berti in the Haran region and Bur Hakaba in the Bay region. These remain today the principal areas where the Ili live in Somalia. Presently, there are approximately 200 to 300 Ili families in Somalia. All right. This is from Caste and Class in Historical Northwest Ethiopia, Beta Israel, and Kamant. All right. And the Kamant people are also a Cushitic people. Okay. By James Curran. This is also from the Journal of African History, 1998, volume 39, number 2. All right. Formation of the Kamant. The name Kamant has not been found in written sources before the 18th century, so their early history is much more obscure than that of the Beta Israel. Their geographical location and linguistic cultural characteristics suggest that they were part of a contiguous Aga-speaking region in the Northwest who began to develop their identity since their first extensive contacts with the Ethiopian state in the early 14th century. Linguistically, the Kamant language and the Aga language of the Beta Israel, variously called in Aramaic Quarinya, Philashinya, or Kayenya, are closely related. Within the Agag language group, certain pairs of languages have particularly close relationships, such as those of are closely related. Within the Agag language group, certain pairs of languages have particularly close relationships, such as those of Quora and Kemet. Beta Israel by the 19th century described the Kemet language as a dialect of ours. Common terminology demonstrates the Agag cultural background shared by the Beta Israel and Kemet. These include, for example, the use of an Agag term, Adara, for God, the belief in spirits associated with particular locations, the term Quitus, holy, by both, and the belief in Zar, spirits. Other cultural practices observed in the 19th century were shared by the two groups, suggesting long-standing common roots. They used the same kinship relations and terminology. Kemet served as fictive kin for Beta Israel in a relationship known as Maiz. Both venerated the Saturday Sabbath and practiced the Tazkar, or memorial service for the dead. Kemet followed the same Hebraic dietary laws, practiced circumcision, and the excision on the 8th day. All right, but notice this. So these are Cushitic peoples who were living around Jews in Ethiopia and East Africa and picked up their customs. Circumcision, the dietary law, right? Also keeping the Sabbath. And this was documented well up until the 1800s amongst these people. Right, and these are not even Semitic peoples. These aren't Israelites. These are Cushitic peoples, right? Though both groups had historically venerated Saturday Sabbath, in the 19th century, Beta Israel felt they observed it in a more orthodox manner than Christians observed either Saturday or Sunday. Beta Israel lit no fires and could do no work or even cross bodies of water on the Sabbath. All right, so the Jews or Israelites in Ethiopia in the 1800s were looking at the other Ethiopians, the other Semitic ones, the Cushitic ones, right, and Nihilistic ones, and looking at them like, y'all, the ones that were Christians, y'all going to church on Sunday, and you saying you keeping the Sabbath on Saturday, but you're not really keeping the Sabbath at all on either day, because you still polluting it. It's not just going to church. They're like, you still breaking it. And they were doing an actual literal Sabbath, like not even kindling a fire. All right, this is from the Africa Journal of Evangelical Theology. All right, Somalia's Judeo-Christian heritage, right? Somalia's Judeo-Christian heritage, a preliminary survey, right? Sabbath observance. While living in the small town of Homboy, Jalib district in southern Somalia in 1988, I noticed that a significant portion of the population obeyed the injunctions of a local religious leader not to cultivate their fields on Saturdays. These people were disciples of Sheikh Ibrahim from the Gari clan, whose father had founded the town in the early 20th century. All right, that the Gari clan, this is another Cushitic group, right? They believed that farm work on Saturdays would result in various plagues striking their fields. All right, notice here, these Cushitic people are still keeping Sabbath, and they're Muslims. And this is in the 1900s. This is still even up until the 1900s, right? He says they believe that farm work on Saturdays will result in various plagues striking their fields. Those observing this Sabbath rest worship normally with other villagers at the mosque on Fridays. I have been told of a family from the Badake clan in Bula Berti in central Somalia that observe a similar taboo on Saturday work. If this issue were to be surveyed, it is likely that more instances would be found. All right, these are from my notes. All right, a series of illustrated articles entitled A Traves de Abyssinia Indomita through Indomitable Abyssinia by J. Lafpu was published not long ago by Ahora, one of the leading daily papers of Madrid, Spain. In the edition of July 20th, 1935, it is said, Thai Abyssinians do not eat swine's flesh. In many parts of the country, people respect the festivity of the Sabbath. The well-known Jesuit daily El Debate of Madrid, in its extraordinary supplement for Sunday, September 15, 1935, published a lengthy article by Manuel Greya, a Roman Catholic writer, concerning the Coptic Church, in which he says of the Abyssinians, with all this, they have preserved many of the practices of the primitive church. So this is a Catholic writer, right, at this newspaper. And remember, at this time, preparing for World War II, the Italians invaded Ethiopia, right? But anyways, so they're saying here, even in the 1900s, the Ethiopian church preserved many practices of the primitive church. When they say the primitive church, they mean the early church, the New Testament church. So they're letting you know that what the Catholics do and what any offshoot of the daughters of the Catholics do, right, even the Protestants or whoever, that's not what the early church was doing, and that's not what they were doing in the New Testament. What you're doing is something man came up with that's not biblical, right? So it goes on to say here, which we Catholics have abandoned. For example, abstinence from the flesh of strangled animals, immersion in baptism. Notice this. So like the Catholics were like, we'll eat food that's been strangled. You don't have to be immersed in water to be baptized. The rest of the Sabbath and the celebration of the agape. Ignatius Loyola, founder of the Jesuit Society, personally cherished the desire to go to Ethiopia and bring it under the sway of the Roman pontiff. But the Pope did not deem it fitting, and the task was committed to others of his society. 3 of their most learned men were chosen and sent by Pope Paul IV in 1555 AD. Andreas de Ovidio, the leader of the group, was invested with special authority from the Pope for the mission, but he found the task difficult and lost his patience. In a letter, Andreas de Ovidio wrote in 1559 AD, until now they do not wish to receive our doctrine nor the faith of Rome. Therefore, we define and declare that of the people of Ethiopia in common, the great and the small, and the learned, and others of the people, Abyssinians do not wish to obey the Holy Church of Rome, right? History of Ethiopia, page 174. All right, close this out. And so now we're going to close out with prayer. All right, but we've shown you a thorough examples of Sabbath being observed in East Africa during medieval times, right? Thoroughly. All right, so that don't let anybody tell you that keeping Sabbath is not part of your culture or anything. Keeping Sabbath is your culture, right? So let's close out with prayer. And then, Lord willing, I'll see y'all tonight for Bible study. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time that you've allowed us to come together and do this history lesson. We pray that this lesson was insightful. We also pray that people learned a lot about the history of East Africa and the history of medieval East Africa especially, and also a little history of Sabbath keeping in Eastern Africa during those times. We thank you and praise you for allowing us to come together. In Jesus' mighty name we pray, amen. All right, shalom, everybody.